The Apache girl's plea. Please, I don't want to belong to them. Let me belong to you instead. Tears through the Texas heat of 1870. Barefoot, bruised, and desperate, she clings to the edge of a forgotten well on a lonely homestead. Robert Hale, a reclusive settler haunted by past sins in the Apache Wars, stands above her with his revolver heavy at his hip. He knows what helping her means, threats from the law, the return of blood-soaked memories. But in her eyes, he sees not just fear, but the desperate gamble of a soul asking for one chance at freedom. Follow this story through fire, ash, and rebirth, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Texas sun blistered everything it touched. It burned the earth until cracks split wide in the clay, until lips bled if they lingered too long in the heat. It sat merciless above the Hale homestead, 30 acres of dust and fences that groaned in the wind. Robert Hale lifted his hammer once more and drove the post down into the dirt. Sweat soaked through his shirt, streaked the back of his neck, and stung the old scar along his jaw. Each swing was steady, deliberate, as if the rhythm alone could keep the ghosts from catching up with him. For a long while there was only the sound of the hammer, the faint swish of his horse's tail flicking flies, and the wheeze of the dry wind. Then something shifted. A brittle gasp, a scrape like stone against stone. Robert froze. He straightened slowly, squinting toward the far end of the yard. Near the back fence sat the old well, half choked with weeds, forgotten, ringed by broken stones. The sound had come from there. His hand moved on instinct to the revolver at his hip. The hammer slipped from his other hand and hit the dirt with a flat thud. Boots crunching hard ground, he walked toward the well. Each step came slower than the last. When he peered over the rim, he saw her. She crouched in the shadow not far below the lip. A girl, no a woman, though barely grown. Her hair clung in braids matted with dust beads of turquoise clinking faintly on her wrist. Her dress was torn, smeared with blood and dirt. Her eyes, wild, sharp, glinting like an animal cornered, met his. Please, she whispered, voice raw as corn husks splitting. I don't want to belong to them. Let me belong to you instead. The words struck Robert like a bullet. He stood rigid, the revolver heavy at his side, the sun glaring merciless above them both. Belong. He had heard the word spat across camps, barked in trade posts, written in ledgers that valued flesh like cattle. He had seen what harboring a runaway meant. Men whipped for less their homes, torched for daring to shelter a girl like her. The law would not protect him. The neighbors would not forget. Every instinct screamed, walk away, turn back, close the door, survive. But then he saw her eyes, not just fear, something deeper. A final desperate gamble, like the look in another child's eyes years ago, the little Apache girl who clung to her mother's skirts just before the flames roared, just before the rifles cracked. The memory stabbed him like a bayonet. Smoke in his throat, screams in his ears, his own rifle raised, his own finger pulling the trigger. Robert squeezed his eyes shut. The ghosts pressed in. When he opened them, she was still there, breathing fast, shivering though the sun scorched the dirt. For a long moment he said nothing. The air stretched thin, the silence waiting to break. Then he knelt. Slowly, without speaking, he extended his hand down toward her. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Her chest rose and fell like she might vanish if she hesitated too long. Then suddenly her hand shot up, grasped his. Thin, calloused, sticky with dried blood. Robert pulled once smooth and strong. She came up over the stones, stumbled on the edge, nearly collapsed. But she caught herself, straightened, and stood barefoot in the dust. Her face was streaked with soot. One cheek swollen with a bruise, a cut above her brow, still bleeding faintly. But her eyes stayed fixed on him, unflinching. She did not cry. He did not ask her name. The two of them stood there, the dry wind twisting between them, waiting to see who would speak first. The woman, her body tense as a deer cornered, finally broke the silence. No one followed me, she blurted, voice shaking. I think I lost them in the riverbed last night. Robert said nothing, but something in him shifted the way a scar itches before rain. She swayed slightly as if her body might give out any moment. Her lips cracked when she spoke again. I will work. I can clean, I can sew. I will not ask for anything. Robert took a breath, deep, heavy, as though preparing to shoulder a weight he had carried before. His jaw clenched. His gaze drifted from her torn dress to the dirt, then to the trough by the barn. At last he spoke, his voice low. "There's water in the trough." Her eyes flickered confused. "I will not stop you," he added, "but if you're staying even just tonight, wash the blood off." He turned, walked back toward the fence, picked up the hammer, lifted it like nothing had changed. But behind him he heard her steps, slow, cautious, following. From the lip of the well, a crow let out a sharp single cry. The past had risen from the dust, and neither of them would face it alone. The water in the trough was warm from the sun, but to her it felt like a river reborn. Ailani cupped it in her hands, let it spill over her face, washing the grit from her eyes. It stung when it touched the cut on her brow, but she welcomed the sting. It meant she was still alive. Her reflection shimmered faint in the ripples, bruises purple along her cheekbone lips. Cracked hair tangled and dull. Not a girl, not yet the woman she might have been. Just something carried too far and dropped too hard, scraped across the edges of a world that saw her as property, not person. Robert stood a distance away, the steady rhythm of his hammer returning as though nothing had changed. But every strike now seemed too deliberate, too sharp, like each blow was forcing thought from his head. Ailani stole glances toward him while scrubbing at the dried blood on her wrists. The rope burns, there were raw, the skin raised angry red. She pressed her lips together and dipped again, letting the water numb what it could. She had been chased too long to expect kindness. When he told her to wash, she had braced for dismissal for the crack of anger that usually followed. But he had walked away instead, giving her no chain, no question, only a sliver of choice. It unsettled her more than cruelty would have. The cabin loomed plain and tired timber's sun-bleached porch, sagging like weary shoulders. Inside it smelled of dust, wood smoke, and solitude. When Ailani stepped through the door, she froze, half expecting a trap, half expecting nothing at all. The hearth was clean, the floor swept bare. A table stood at the center, scarred from years of use, with only a lantern resting atop. A single chair, a single bedroll in the corner. The room was silent enough that her own breath sounded like trespass. Robert came in behind her, boots scraping. He hung his hat on a nail, crossed the room, set down the hammer without a word. The quiet pressed hard between them. Ailani moved to the corner, lowered herself onto the floorboards, and drew her knees up. Her muscles ached, but she sat straight, refusing to look weak. She had learned long ago weakness was invitation. Robert stirred the stove, dropped a log inside, and crouched low until the flame caught. Orange light flickered across the room, painting his face with long shadows. His profile was cut sharp, jaw-clenched eyes, fixed on the fire, like it alone deserved his attention. Finally, without looking at her, he spoke. "You can sleep here tonight." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She nodded once, quick, as if the nod itself might vanish if she held it too long. 2 days passed in silence. At dawn she rose before him, fetching water from the creek, scrubbing her torn dress until her knuckles cracked. She swept the porch with a branch broom, straightened tools by the wall, scrubbed rust from his knives. Her movements were small offerings, proof she would not be a burden. Robert returned from the fields each evening to find the cabin altered in subtle ways. The hearth swept clean, the pail filled, the stew pot rinsed and set upside down on the shelf. She never asked permission. She never lingered near him. She moved with the watchful patience of someone who knew her stay was temporary. A pause. A borrowed corner in a world built to discard her again. Robert said nothing, but he watched. He saw the way her shoulders hunched when footsteps sounded in the distance, the way she froze at every crow's cry as if expecting men to come. He recognized it. He had seen soldiers carry the same tension before a final march. Eyes sharpened by too much loss, waiting for the blow that would finish the job. The third morning, the sound of hooves split the air. Robert cursed under his breath, rising from the pasture fence. 2 riders crested the ridge, coats gray with dust rifles across their backs. Their badges flashed dull in the sun, circuit officers, tax surveyors, men who turned every homestead inside out once a year. Robert's boots hit the porch hard. "Ailani," he said, voice low, urgent. "Inside." She obeyed without a word, slipping behind the door, crouching in shadow breath caught in her throat. The riders drew up, slow reins taut, one dismounted ledger in hand. "Morning hail," he said. "Just routine. Confirm holdings, livestock, anyone living on the land. Robert's jaw tightened. He kept his stance easy, arms folded, though his pulse hammered. Same as last year. 2 horses. 1 mule. Just me. The younger officer squinted toward the window. I thought I saw a woman. Robert didn't blink. Housekeeper. Took her on this year. Long winter. Name, the older one asked, pencil poised. A pause. Robert's hand curled slightly at his side. Then, slow and deliberate, he reached for the ledger. Took the pencil. Wrote in careful strokes, Ellen Black. Black. The officer repeated. Robert handed the book back. My mother's name, Cherokee. Girls got nowhere else to go. Silence hung tight as a rope. Behind the door, Ailani's breath burned. Her heart thudded against her ribs loud enough she thought they'd hear it. Finally, the younger man shrugged. She better not cause trouble. Lot of girls running from things these days. Robert's eyes hardened. She won't. The riders left dust trailing behind them. That night, Ailani sat by the hearth shelling beans with shaking hands. Robert passed behind her with an armful of dried corn husks. He paused. The fire popped. Without turning, he said quietly, Black. Her hands froze. You gave me a name, she whispered. Robert set the husk down, knelt to feed the fire. Flames licked higher, casting his face in golden shadow. You needed one, he said. Ailani turned, staring at him, her expression unreadable. A girl waiting to vanish, yet tethered suddenly to something she couldn't name. You don't have to keep me, she murmured. I know this is temporary. Robert stood, his face still carved in stone, but in his eyes something flickered. You wake before I do. The coffee's hot. My boots are cleaner. I don't do things I regret. She lowered her gaze to her dirt-cracked knuckles, the bruises still dark on her wrist. She had belonged to too many names before property girl fugitive, but this one had been written in ink in front of men with badges. Later that night when Robert slept, she moved to the window. Her fingers brushed the wooden frame. There carved, faint but sure, was the word again. Black. Not a promise, but a place to begin. Night held the cabin like a closed fist. Wind hissed against the chinks, testing the boards. The ledger scene replayed in both their minds, the pencil scraping the pause, the word he had chosen. Black. A name laid down in ink between a man with a badge and a man with a past. A thin shield, a thin line, and yet something. Ailani lay wakeful on the floor beside the hearth-head on a folded blanket, listening to Robert's slow breathing from the corner where he slept. She could not remember the last time she'd slept without one ear open. Tonight would not be it. She traced the grain in the floor with her finger. Knots like eyes stared back. The name pulsed in her mind. Not girl, not goods. Not a price on paper traveling from hand to hand. Black. She turned her head toward the window. Moonlight licked the frame where the letters were cut faint but sure. She had found them earlier when the shadows were long and the cabin empty. BLACK. Not fancy. Not deep. Just enough for a fingertip to find and follow. She followed them now. In her mind. Over and over. As if memorizing would make them true. Across the room, Robert shifted and went still. He hadn't slept much either. He lay on his back, palms on his ribs, the way men sleep who've learned to wake already reaching for steel, but the revolver hung on its nail. He had left it there on purpose. A private dare to himself stand without it, see if the night would pass. It did. Barely. Dawn came slow. Color bled behind the far ridge. The stove coughed, then hummed as Ailani coaxed the fire awake. The smell of coffee crept across the room, thin, bitter, precious. Robert sat up, hair-crushed, flat eyes, already scanning the room like he expected it to be different. It was. There was heat. There was a tin cup waiting on the table. She didn't look at him when he took it. He didn't thank her. The thanks was in the way he didn't look around for what else she'd touched. They ate in silence, corn cakes torn by hand, last night's beans, warmed coffee swallowed more for courage than taste. When he rose for the door, she spoke so softly he almost missed it. Black, she said, as if testing how the word felt leaving her throat. He paused. Hand on the latch. half-turned. "My mother's name," he said. "Her mother's before. Cherokee. It belonged to someone who chose her own way." Ailani blinked. Her eyes flicked to the window frame. "Then I will carry it careful." He nodded once. Not approval. Recognition. Outside wind ran its hands through the dry grass. Robert crossed the yard with the deliberate gait of a man counting every stride. He checked fence wire, tightened a sagging run, set his shoulder to the post-hole digger, and worked until the ache in his arms took the edge off the ache in his head. Ailani stood at the trough with a pail, the sun finding bruises along her cheekbone that had turned a dirty yellow. She lifted water, carried it to the porch, then to the shade of the wall. She scrubbed the threshold as if washing an altar. When the floorboards dried, she took a scrap of rag and oiled the hinges so the door would not protest every opening. Thick household work, invisible to anyone who didn't live inside it. Work that builds a kind of quiet no thief can see. By noon, sweat had pasted her dress to her back. She tied her braids again and walked to the edge of the yard where the earth fell toward the creek. The path slid under her bare feet, smooth from years of buckets and boots. Cottonwoods gathered there, their leaves whispering secrets with each gust. She knelt at the water's lip and stared at the bent reflection, new name, old eyes. On the bank, willow ran low and green. She glanced over her shoulder, listening. No hoofbeats, no men laughing where they shouldn't be. She slipped a small knife from the pouch at her waist and cut bark in thin curls. When she returned, Robert was repairing the gate latch with a new peg carved from oak. He looked at the curls of pale bark in her palm. "Willow," she said, "for pain, for fever." A pause. "I can make a tea, if you want." His gaze lifted to hers. For a moment he saw the woman in the well hand's raw voice breaking. Now he saw a different thing layered on top, craft memory carried in the fingers. "Make it," he said simply. She did. She stripped the bark, shaved it thin, boiled it in the dented pot with creek water, and a patience most folks had forgotten how to keep. When she poured it out, the cabin smelled faintly of wet wood and rain. Robert tested it with the careful sip. The bitterness sat square on the tongue, then softened, leaving a coolness that had nothing to do with temperature. He nodded and set the cup down. "You know plants," he said. "My mother did," Ailani answered. "She said the earth keeps answers in its green places. Men just don't ask the right questions." His mouth twitched like it almost remembered how to smile. In the heat of the afternoon, he shifted tools in the lean-to, counting nails by feel, wiping rust from a saw whose teeth still bit true. She stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the yard, the way hawks scan fields, moving, pausing, moving again. "Rules," Robert said, as if the word weighed more than the tools. He didn't look up. "Until we know who's watching." She stilled, waiting. "You don't go past the cottonwoods before dark, not alone. If riders come, you go to the root cellar door behind the crate. You don't open it until I say. If anyone asks, you're Ellen Black and you've got a temper mean as a hornet." Her head tipped, not quite a smile. "And you?" she asked. He slid the saw into its slot. "I fix fences, and I keep my mouth shut. And if the men with badges come again," she pressed. He wiped his hands on a rag, turned to face her fully. "I'll look them in the eyes and tell the same lie." She studied him a long moment, as if weighing the distance between his words and the man who spoke them. Finally she nodded. "Then I will know where to run." Evening fell in long sheets of copper. The land went quiet in the ways that mean danger and mercy both. They ate on the porch steps, bread split a small onion they shared raw, its sting making their eyes water without tears. Coyotes yipped far off a chorus that never learned the word stop. Ailani cleared the dishes. Robert stayed on the step, elbows on his knees, watching the first stars find each other. "Ellen," he said, testing the shape of the name he'd written in another man's book. It felt strange in his mouth, borrowed, necessary, true enough to stand on for now. She turned in the doorway. "Yes, if you plan to plant," he said, eyes still on the yard. "Westpatch takes the evening shade, holds water better." Her breath caught a sound too soft to carry. He had not said, "Don't plant." He had said, "Where?" After the dishes, she took a short-handled hoe from the wall and walked to the hard strip of ground he'd pointed with his chin. The soil was stubborn, baked into a shield. She set her heel lifted, drove the blade in, a shallow slice. Then another. Then another. The work made a rhythm out of breath and will. From the porch, Robert listened to the scrape. The sound threaded through old echoes, hose, yes, and also marching feet, drum beats, the chain clatter of bridles before a raid. The scrape of a hoe was better. It put something back. When she returned, the back of her neck shone with sweat. She leaned the hoe where it had hung and stood with palms on the table, head bowed, breathing slow to tame the gallop in her chest. "You don't have to do it all tonight," he said. "I know," she answered, "but I need the earth to know my hands." Wind pushed a thin veil of dust through the doorway. She smiled at it like at an old friend who still owed her a visit. Later, when the lamp was turned low and the world outside thinned to crickets and the occasional restless hoof in the corral, Robert opened a small tin and set it on the table. Inside lay a strip of blue cloth, faded, frayed at one edge, wrapped around something small. He unrolled it slowly. A beaded bracelet, turquoise and white, the thread darkened with time. He set it between them. "My mother's," he said. "She traded for it in a year when corn failed and folks had to make beauty out of what didn't feed them. She wore it on Sundays and the day she left." He swallowed. "I don't keep many things. This one stayed." Ailani's eyes fixed on the beads. Her own wrist still wore a thread with a single stone that had somehow escaped knives and ropes and riverbeds. She touched it, then drew her hand away as though afraid to insult a ghost. "I didn't bring you a thing," she murmured. "You brought me a lie I could live with," he said. "Sometimes that's how truth begins." She looked up. The lamp's small flame drew a line of gold along her cheekbone. "You think this can hold?" she asked. "Names made in the mouths of men with pencils." He considered the bracelet, considered the window frame, considered the way the word black had settled in the room without taking it hostage. "It'll hold until something better does," he said. "And if it doesn't, I'll nail 2 boards together and call that a door. We'll walk through it anyway." A small sound escaped her, then half laugh, half breath. She didn't realize she'd been saving. She lifted the bracelet, held it in both hands, and then, without putting it on, laid it carefully on the shelf above the stove where heat wouldn't crack it, and eyes would not ignore it. Behind them, the night thickened. An owl called once, twice. Silence folded itself around the cabin like a blanket stitched by a tired hand. On the 3rd day after the ledger, a peddler's cart creaked along the road a quarter-mile off. The sound carried across the flats like a tin can rolling in an empty church. Robert stiffened. Ailani faded back from the doorway without being told. The cart did not turn toward the gate. The driver did not look. 2 minutes of sound, then only wind again. "Almost," she said from the shadows. "Almost," he agreed. That afternoon he took a shovel to the west patch and turned a strip of ground beside her furrows, 1 past 2, then stepping out to let her hands claim it. No speech, no ceremony. A shared handle for the work. When the sun sank, he leaned the shovel against the porch rail. She set a small flat stone on the newly broken earth. No marks on it. Not yet. Just a weight to tell the sky that something below had changed. Inside, Robert returned the ledger image to its shelf in his mind and tried to file it under done. But the pencil's pause stayed with him. What right did he have to name her none? What else could have kept the men from writing another word? He didn't know. At the table he pulled a scrap of paper from a Bible with no cover and wrote, not because he meant to keep it, but because sometimes handwriting is the only way to see a thought without flinching. Ellen Black, until she says otherwise. He folded the scrap once and slid it under the tin of coffee. Outside, Ailani stood beneath the cottonwood's eyes on the last line of light slipping off the ridge. She touched the thin thread at her wrist. She touched the window frame as she came in. B-L-A-C-K. The letters had not moved. Neither had she. Not property. Not erased. Not safe, not yet. But named. And in that small stubborn fact, a floorboard in the future shifted into place. The west patch of earth lay raw and scarred where the hoe had cut it open. By morning, Ailani knelt over it again, her hands already black with soil. The ground fought her stubborn as bone, but she pressed ash from the stove into the cracks. Mixed water with the dust until mud clung to her nails. Seed by seed, she planted squash beans, corn, all from the small pouch Robert had left on the porch, without a word. Her palms bled where blisters had split. Still, she worked. The garden was not just food, it was proof. Proof she could leave something behind other than footprints and dust. Robert watched from the shade of the barn. He didn't interfere, didn't offer advice, only noted the determination in her shoulders, the way she leaned forward as if daring the earth to deny her. He recognized that dare. He had lived by it. He wondered if she would outlast it. By dusk, sweat ran in rivers down her back, and her lips cracked with thirst. She carried the pail to the trough, filled it twice, poured slow streams over the seeds. When the water sank, she pressed her hand flat against the damp soil, as if sealing a pact with the land. The first shoots came within a week. Green stabbed through brown, small and defiant. Robert found her crouched over them one morning, whispering something he could not hear. He stood with his mug of coffee, watching, and thought he heard the sound of prayer, not to a god, but to the earth itself. The neighbors noticed. A rider passing by, slowed eyes narrowing at the sudden green behind the Hale cabin. Word carried faster than the wind across fences. That red girl is up to something. The land don't bloom like that without curses. Don't trust it. At the general store, Robert heard a rancher mutter to another, "She's Apache." Soil turns strange under their hands. You watch. Nothing good'll come. Robert said nothing, just paid for nails, sugar, a sack of flour, and walked out with his jaw set. Ailani heard the whispers too. One afternoon, as she bent to pull weeds, 3 boys from a neighboring spread lingered near the fence, barely 10 dust streaking their cheeks, pockets bulging with pebbles. "Hey, engine girl," one shouted voice, sharp with cruelty he'd learned from older mouths. "Bet you whisper to your crops, huh?" The second boy hurled a stone. It struck her arm, stinging. She flinched but did not lift her head. Another pebble followed, then laughter. Robert stepped from the barn hammer still in hand. He didn't speak, didn't raise the hammer. He simply stood behind Ailani, broad in silent shadow, stretching long across the dirt. The boys froze. Their laughter died in their throats. Then without a word they turned and ran, dust pluming at their heels. Ailani didn't turn to look at him. She kept pulling weeds, though her hands trembled faintly. But that evening, when Robert returned from the pasture, he found a small woven ring hanging above the kitchen window, dried grass braided with sage, tucked with 2 wildflowers. It wasn't decoration. It was a mark, a sign carved not in wood but in ritual. "This is mine, this place, this space. I claim it." Robert said nothing, but when the wind rattled the frame that night, the ring stayed. The days lengthened. The shoots grew taller, curling around strings she had stretched along the fence. Neighbors kept their distance, though suspicion hung in the air, heavier than summer dust. One evening, Robert sat sharpening his axe on the porch, watching the horizon. Ailani knelt by the garden mud, streaking her arms, hair slipping from its braids. She rose, walked toward him, carrying a squash leaf in her palm. The green veins glistened under the twilight. "They're listening," she said, lifting the leaf slightly, eyes fierce. "Plants listen when you ask them to." Robert studied her axe blade, glinting faint in the light. "You think they'll feed us?" "I don't think," she said, voice sharp as the leaf's edge. "I know, because I planted them." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Robert leaned back, set the axe aside, and nodded. "Then I'll build a fence high enough they live long enough to prove you right." Ailani's throat tightened, not from gratitude, from recognition. For the first time since she had stumbled out of that well, she realized he wasn't just sheltering her. He was believing in what her hands could make. That night, as coyotes sang in the distance, she lay by the hearth staring at the rafters. Her fingers brushed the woven ring above the window, its shape outlined by firelight. The world had called her property, had tried to make her believe she was only what could be traded or chained. But here in this cabin, with its plain timbers and its silent man, she had left a mark no one could burn in ledger ink. And in the silence, Robert sat awake at the table, watching the glow of the coals. He thought of the word he had written in the officer's book. Black. It had been a shield, yes, but maybe it was also a door, and maybe, just maybe, they had already stepped through it together. It began with a good day, the kind of day the land seldom offered without asking for something back. A south wind moved the heat around instead of pinning it to the dirt. Ailani's beans had climbed another rung, green fingers hooking into the twine as if they meant to pull the whole sky down for shade. Robert had rehung the gate so it didn't groan like an injured thing every time it swung. He was almost pleased, though, the word sat strange in him and refused to be said out loud. Inside a pot of stew shouldered its way toward a slow boil. On the shelf above the stove, a rag clean too close waited for its lesson. A hawk called from somewhere past the cottonwoods. A horse stamped. The wind shifted. The corner of the rag lifted, toyed with a curl of flame, touched it, drew back, then touched again. Ailani was at the table, stripping willow curls for the evening's tea. She smelled it before she saw it. Not smoke like a cook fire should be, but something brighter meaner, edged with panic. She looked up. The cloth had become a tongue of fire. It licked the shelf, found a sliver of oil left from last winter, and laughed as it ran. "Robert," she said, already moving. He reached the stove in 3 strides, tore a wool blanket from the cot, and slammed it down over the flames. The blanket hissed. Flame went dark, then bright again, fighting like a trapped cat. He shoved harder, forearms braced. His right arm slid across the black iron lip of the pot. The sound was small. A kiss. Then the skin sizzled and the world staggered. Robert sucked air through his teeth and lurched back. The blanket finished what he'd started, smothering the fire into a smoky sulk, but the damage had already put its mark on him. "Sit," Ailani said. He didn't. He stood still as a post-jaw locked eyes bright with a pain he refused to look at. Smoke gathered in the rafters, then climbed toward the cracks and wriggled into the summer day. "Sit," she said again, already fetching the tin basin, already pouring cool well water that ran silver in the lamplight. He sat. The skin from wrist to elbow blazed the color of a new dawn. A blister had already begun its slow, grotesque rise. He tried to pull his forearm away when the water hit, but she held him. Not cruelly, not with strength, but with steadiness. That said, "We are doing this." The man who had not been stopped by rifles stopped for that. "It's fine." He muttered the lie flat as a coin. "I've had worse." "It still hurts," she answered, and in her voice was both command and mercy. He swallowed. The tendon in his neck stood out like a rope pulled too tight. She lifted the scorched arm, watched the water carry the heat into the basin in faint, wicked ribbons. She turned his palm without asking and found the edge of another life buried in his skin. Old scars, thin, pale rivers leading nowhere. "Hold," she said softly. She went to the cupboard and reached deep into the shadow most folks never saw. From it, she drew a small doe-hide pouch bound with a strip of faded cloth, a poor woman's medicine chest tied to the years like a memory you wear. She worked by feel fingers' sure movements clean. On the table, she laid a handful of plantain leaves she had found along the creek, a pinch of yarrow flakes, 2 slender strips of aloe-wet nopal she'd shaved from a prickly pear pad that morning, just because the plant had looked at her like a friend. In a tin cup, she mashed and mixed, added a breath of honey and a smear of lard to make the salve cling. Robert watched her make medicine out of the day's ordinary. No mystery, no witchcraft, just knowledge carried forward like a song with too few words but the right tune. She dried his arm with the gentlest part of the rag testing with the back of her finger where the heat still rose. Then she spread the salve, cool as creek shade, over the burn. He exhaled so long he had to steal air again in a rush. "Easy," she murmured. He looked at her. Really looked at the furrow in her brow, where concentration sat like a temporary crown at the tiny scar near the corner of her mouth, where a laugh had once been stolen at the turquoise bead on her wrist that had somehow survived every river and rope that tried to take it. Her hands moved without tremor. They were the hands of someone who had not been permitted to keep much, so she had learned to keep knowledge instead. The pain narrowed, became a border instead of a flood. She wrapped his arm with a band of clean linen she'd torn from a petticoat 2 nights ago, with the simple thought there will be need. A knot. Not too tight. Her fingers paused, then pressed once like a prayer that never bothered with words. He sat stunned by the fact of her touch, more than by the pain that had led to it. "You knew what to do," he said finally. "I was taught," she replied. "My mother burned her hand once on an iron left too near the fire. She said the earth doesn't punish. It answers, if you ask it right. Robert's gaze slid to the stove, to the shelf, to the black mouth now sulking low. Then I asked wrong. He set a corner of his mouth thinking about humor and deciding against it. She didn't smile, but something warmed the air between them anyway. Smoke thinned. The cabin settled again into the hush of a place that had almost lost itself and didn't. Ailani rinsed the basin and set it outside, letting the dirty water sink into the thirsty step. When she came back, Robert was still on the bench, cradling his arm like a man who had found he was more breakable than he'd believed. "Thank you," he said, and the words sounded like they had been sharpened on stone before being allowed out. She nodded. "Keep it high if you can. Don't break the blisters. I'll change it when the sun moves the length of that board." She pointed to a floor plank with a nick at one end, the kind of mark you use when time is a thing you measure by light and not by clocks. He followed her finger, then watched the light for a moment as if it could be trusted. "Rest," she added. "I don't," he started. She lifted an eyebrow, the tiniest challenge, and he stopped. "Lay back." Closed his eyes because she had said to, and because he was suddenly very tired of not obeying simple orders that meant no harm. While he rested, she fixed the shelf, moved the clean rags to a safer notch, set a pot of water on a back burner where flame could lick without thinking about the future. Her movements were the quiet corrections of a house taking its second breath. He woke to the sound of her voice. Not to him, to the garden. She stood in the doorway, dusk painting her in reverse fire, and spoke in a low, steady thread. Not words he knew, not English, not a prayer he recognized, just the cadence of belonging. "Talking to your crops?" he asked, and there was a scrape of humor in it this time. She didn't turn. "They listen," she said. "They like to be reminded the ground still holds them." "What do you say?" "That they are not alone." Silence found them both for a moment, then settled in the rafters like a friend who had been invited to stay. When she came back in, he lifted his arm on his own and turned it so she could see. The shine of the salve had dulled where the skin had drunk what it was offered. The angry red had faded to a lesser rage. "You heal fast," she said. "You mend men faster," he answered, and watched color rise into her cheeks as if the truth itself were a heat. They ate late thick stew rescued from smoked bread torn into it by hand coffee that tasted faintly of ash and habit. His left hand did the work his right couldn't, and the clumsiness made him look younger for a minute, almost shy. When the spoon clattered against the bowl, she didn't wince. She reached over and steadied the rim, a small, ordinary rescue. "Tomorrow you'll tell me which weeds I can't pull," he said. "I know fences, not leaves." She nodded. "Plantain stays. It heals more than it looks like it can." "So do you," he said, and didn't take it back when the words surprised him. Night arrived without riders, which is another way of saying it arrived kindly. Crickets took the place of hawks. The horse in the lean-to sighed like someone at last allowed to sit. Ailani unhooked the woven ring from the window, strengthened the twist where a strand had loosened in the heat, and added a thread from the hem of her dress. She hung it back up. "What's it for?" he asked. "Telling the door what kind of house it guards," she said simply. He looked at the ring, at the medicine pouch, at the neat shelf where cloth and kindling had been scolded into obedience. He looked at the bandage on his arm, and at the woman who had put it there, and at the world that had decided to keep turning anyway. "Black," he said, testing the name she wore in front of strangers. She looked up. "You have a place here," he said. "It isn't much. It's not safe like a church or a town with a bell, but it is ours as long as we stand in it." Her lips parted. Not a smile. Something steadier. Something that had learned not to ask too much from the day and therefore could be grateful when the day gave anything at all. "Then I'll keep it," she said. "Good," he answered, and it meant more than good. Before he banked the fire, he took a small block of pine and a knife from the shelf and sat with them like a man relearning a language he had once spoken. His right arm ached, his left hand did the carving, slow, careful. A shape emerged, not a horse, not a bird, just a curve that fit comfortably in a palm. He set it on the table. "What is it?" she asked. "A thing to hold," he said. She picked it up. The wood was warm from his hands. She closed her fingers around it and found it fit as if the world had left a place for it there. "Thank you," she said. And the words when she gave them were not the kind you throw after a favor. They were the kind you set between two people and let live. He blew out the lamp. The cabin darkened to the color of rest. Outside, a breeze moved through the garden across the beans that had understood the day and forgiven it. In the near dark, Robert spoke, voice low enough to pass for a thought. "You ran toward the fire," he said. "Most folks run the other way." Ailani lay down by the hearth, her eyes finding the faint outline of the ring in the window. "I've been burned worse by staying still," she answered. He was quiet a long time after that. "Then sleep," he said. "I'll wake before the sun." She didn't argue. She let the floor hold her, and for the first time since the well sleep came without its knife. When it left her in the gray before morning, the bandage was dry, the cabin unburned, the garden alive, and the man with the scar on his jaw already outside his shadow, moving in the light like a promise kept. It had been a good day. The house had asked for its tax and been paid. And in the paying, something else had been purchased that neither of them dared name. Not yet. Not out loud. But it stood in the room like another person. Truss sweating in the heat, smelling faintly of willow tea and char. The heat rose thicker with each day, but it wasn't the sun that made Robert's shoulders tighten or Ailani's breath falter when the wind shifted. It was the silence of waiting. Silence that knew someone would come, because men like Silas Draper never left things unfinished. The first sign was the dust, a thin brown ribbon on the horizon moving against the wind. Robert saw it from the pasture fence and spat into the dirt. The taste in his mouth was old iron, the same he had swallowed too many times before battles. Ailani was at the garden pulling weeds, her dress smeared at the knees with soil. When she saw him stiffen, she looked where he looked, then froze. The dust grew wider. A rider. One. The hoofbeats came slow, deliberate, the way a man rode when he believed nothing could touch him. And then Draper appeared, tall in the saddle coat, black as tar silver spur, glinting like a smirk. The scar over his brow dragged his face into a permanent sneer. He dismounted at the edge of the fence, hand resting casual on the pistol at his hip. His eyes slid from Robert to Ailani and lingered. She felt her throat close, but she didn't move. "Not this time." "Afternoon," Draper drawled. "Word says you've been keeping something that don't belong to you." Robert stepped forward, axe still in his hand from the fence work. "She's not yours." Draper tilted his head, amused. "Oh, come now. You know how this works. Property's property." She ran. "I paid good coin. I've come to collect." "You leave," Robert said flatly. Draper chuckled, not loud but sharp as barbed wire. "Didn't take you for a preacher, Hale. Last I checked, you were one of us. Sierra runs, remember 50 a scalp, wasn't it? Apache or Comanche didn't matter. You were faster than most. Deadlier, too." Ailani's breath hitched. Her eyes snapped to Robert. He didn't look back, jaw locked. Draper stepped closer, boots grinding the dirt. "Funny how fast a man forgets the blood he spilled when there's a woman watching. But you and I, we know the truth. Hunters don't turn holy. You can paint your walls, grow your beans, even put a name on her, but she's still what she was bought for. And you—" He leaned forward. Voice a rasp. "You're still a killer." The axe handle creaked in Robert's grip. His shoulders trembled with the urge to swing. He dropped it. Picked up a shovel instead, longer, heavier, with a blade that could split a skull as clean as it split earth. The smirk faltered. Draper's hand drifted closer to his pistol. Ailani saw it, the space between men narrowing the way Robert's eyes burned with the same fire she'd seen in others' men who never came back from it. She moved before she could think. She shoved herself between them, pressing her body between the shovel and the holster. "Don't," she gasped. Robert's chest heaved. The tendons in his neck stood taut as rope. Draper's smirk twitched back to life. "Look at that," he sneered. "She's got fire. But fire don't make her yours. She's mine. Always was." "She's not mine," Robert said, his voice low, ragged. "She's free." Draper spat into the dust. "Ain't no such thing for her kind." He turned mounted, spat again. "You'll regret this, Hale." Then he rode off, dust curling in his wake. Robert stood rigid, chest rising like bellows. The shovel trembled in his grip. Then slow, he lowered it, carried it to the edge of the property, where the soil was softer from spring floods. Ailani followed at a distance, heart thudding. Without a word, he drove the blade into the earth, not to swing but to dig. He dug until his shoulders shook, until dirt caked his hands and sweat cut rivers down his back. A hole wide deep. Then he laid the shovel in it, and with his bare hands he covered it again. Each scoop of earth pressed something heavier out of him, something old, something he had carried since the raids. When he finished, he stood with hands stained brown, chest heaving. He didn't look at her. He just walked back to the house, jaw tight. That night when he came inside, Ailani had left something on the table, a cup of cool water, and beside it a flat stone. On its face, drawn in ash, was a spiral, not an ending, not a curse, a turning inward, healing. Beginning again. Robert stared at it a long while. His burned arm throbbed beneath the bandage, but the weight in his chest eased. For the first time in years, he had buried a weapon without meaning to dig it up again. The fire came 3 nights later. Not the kind that flickers warm in a hearth, but the kind men set with oil and laughter. It began with a smell, not smoke from stew or lamp oil, sharper, crueler. Gasoline. Robert stirred awake before dawn, the hair on his arms prickling. Ailani sat upright on the pallet by the hearth, eyes wide. Her voice was a whisper that cut the dark. "Do you smell it?" He didn't answer. He was already moving. His hand found hers, pulled her to the back of the cabin. He tore open the root cellar door hidden behind stacked crates. "Down," he hissed. No time to gather, no time to save, only themselves. She slid into the tunnel first, the earth cold against her palms. Robert followed, yanking the hatch closed as glass shattered above them. Flame roared, greedy and sudden, filling the cabin like a beast that had waited too long for meat. The tunnel was narrow, stifling, dug years ago for potatoes. Now it was salvation. They crawled, dirt crumbling under their elbows, breath catching in the smoke that wormed its way down. Ailani led by feel, her fingers tracing the side where roots had left grooves. At last, air. They burst out behind the ridge, tumbling into brush, gasping. From there they saw the cabin burn. Flames leapt into the night sky, sparks bursting like mad fireflies. The roof collapsed, timbers shrieking as they gave way, and silhouetted in the blaze men, drapers. They stomped on the porch, laughed as shingles caved. One kicked at the stacked firewood, another pissed into the garden. They carried rifles, but didn't bother to use them. The fire did all the killing they wanted. Ailani grabbed Robert's sleeve. "Don't," she whispered. Her grip was iron, but he didn't move anyway. He only stood, face lit by orange fury eyes locked on the destruction. His jaw worked, but no sound came. "They came back," he muttered. His voice was low, strangled. "They took everything, again." The fire painted his face, an old ghost's wife, sunblood on the dirt, a house lost once before. Ailani pressed her forehead against his arm, but he did not see her. Not yet. When the riders finally rode off drunk on smoke and victory, silence fell heavy. They stayed crouched in the brush until dawn, not sleeping, not speaking. Morning revealed only bones of the cabin, charred beams black against a pale sky. The stone chimney stood like an old spine, crooked but unbroken. Ash coated everything. The garden was gone, stalks melted into shadows, soil scarred. Robert walked to the front step, or what had been one. He sank onto it, the wood crumbling under his weight. His fists were clenched so tight the knuckles shone white through soot. Ailani stood a few feet back watching. He looked like a man hollowed out. She bent, lifted a stone blackened by fire. It was heavy, solid, still hot to the touch. Beside it lay his pocket knife, half buried in ash, the blade warped but not broken. She scratched a word into the stone with the knife's edge. Letters crude, jagged, but clear. "Stay." She carried it to the threshold and set it down where the door had once been. Robert stared at it, at her. His mouth twitched, not a smile, but something. This land was burnt before she said, voice hoarse from smoke. "We made it bloom. We will again." He shook his head, eyes on the ruins of the garden. "I don't know if I can. Start over. Watch it fall again." Ailani stepped closer. Dirt streaking her face, ash tangled in her braids. "You don't have to do it for the land. Or for me." She met his gaze steady. "Do it so you can say they didn't break you." The words hung between them, sharp, true. For a long moment, Robert said nothing. Then slowly his hand reached for hers. His fingers shook when they closed around hers. They stood like that, two burned figures against burned earth, but upright, alive, choosing. That evening, as the coals still glowed, Ailani stacked unburnt stones where the fence had once run. Each movement was deliberate, quiet reclamation. Robert sat watching, his breath slow. When she finished, she came back and sat beside him. Stars broke through the smoke brighter than they'd been in weeks. Without a roof, there was only sky. For the first time in years, Robert did not dream of war, and in the silence, the stone at the threshold glowed faintly with its carved word. Stay. It was not a plea. It was a command, and for the first time he believed it. The rain came before the week was out. A soft curtain first, then a steady drumming that made the scorched ground hiss and steam. Robert stood bareheaded in the yard, letting it soak him, his burned arm unbandaged to the sky. Ailani tilted her face upward, braids heavy with water, lips parted in silence. For a long while, neither moved. They let the rain baptize the ash. They let it right over the fire with a new script, "Green will return." By afternoon, the ruins softened. Charred beams darkened soil, turned to mud, the smell of smoke replaced with the sharp scent of wet clay. The garden was gone, yes, but the earth beneath it drank greedily, like it too wanted another chance. Rebuilding began with hands, not tools. Robert salvaged what timbers he could, pried stones loose from the chimney base, hammered bent nails straight against a rock. Ailani cleared debris with a hoe, her bare feet sinking in mud, her skirt streaked to the knees. They worked until their spines ached, until breath came ragged, until the new walls began to stand in the skeleton of the old. By late summer, 4 posts rose proud against the horizon. A frame stretched between them, roof beam hoisted high with rope and gritted teeth. No roof yet, no chimney, but a shape, a house being reborn. That night, under a canvas tarp strung over the beam, they lit a small fire. Rain drummed overhead. They ate bread and beans, steam curling into the damp air. Ailani sat with her knees drawn up, hair dripping. Her eyes strayed to the beam above, to the fresh pine Robert had carved into shape. She watched as he pulled his knife, leaned close, and began to scratch into the wood. The strokes were slow, careful. Letters took shape. Her name. She froze. Breath caught. For the first time in her life, her name lived in wood instead of whispers. She reached out, touched the lines with her fingertips. "I've never seen it written like this," she whispered. Robert didn't meet her eyes. "Now it holds the roof up." Tears stung her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Instead, she laid her palm flat against the carving as if anchoring herself there forever. Autumn found the cabin whole again, rough but steady. The roof creaked in wind, but it held. The chimney puffed smoke once more, carrying the scent of stew and wood smoke into the cold. Neighbors drifted by with excuses, checking fences, asking for spare nails. They saw the garden sprouting once again, saw the cabin reborn, and whispered among themselves. Some spat in the dirt, muttered about curses. Others lowered their eyes ashamed, but not enough to speak. Robert ignored them. He split posts, built chairs, mended wagons. Word spread the quiet one worked honest, charged fair, and asked no questions. Ailani gathered women around the hearth. At first only children came, lured by cornbread and the promise of stories. Then the mothers followed. She taught them what she knew: how to dye cloth with walnut shells, how to steep willow bark for coughs, how to stitch birds into aprons for safe return. At first they looked at her like she was a wild thing. But when Maggie Pearson's cough eased, when Mrs. Boyd's quilt finally stitched without breaking thread, the fear thinned. They began to call her something new. Sundaughter. Not savage, not fugitive. Sundaughter. The word wrapped around her shoulders like a cloak of light. One evening, Robert came in with a bundle wrapped in burlap. He set it on the table without a word. Ailani unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a bowl, handmade, rough at the rim, painted in ochre tones. At the center, a sun. Beneath it, a hand. Her breath caught. She looked at him. He rubbed the back of his neck awkward. "It's not much. Just thought it might belong here." She touched the glaze smooth under her fingertips. "It does," she whispered. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. She placed the bowl in the center of the table between them and pressed her forehead to his in the way her mother once did to say thank you. Outside, the last light faded into wide strokes of gold. Inside, the cabin hummed with something more than survival. It hummed with choosing. Morning rose clean and bright, the kind of light that made the new pine glimmer, the rope caulking in the seams shine like thin rivers. The house looked different in such light, less like a survivor, more like something that had always meant to be here. Robert stepped out with the first steam of coffee and stood a long moment, letting the air carry the scent of damp ash and cut wood. Behind him, the stove ticked as it remembered last night's fire and decided to forgive it. Ailani swept the porch with a cedar broom she had bound herself. Her strokes were small, exacting the work of someone who believed corners deserved dignity as much as the center of a room. When the last line of dust slipped down the steps, she shook the bristles off like a dog shaking river water. Across the yard, beans threaded themselves up twine with a quiet confidence he envied. Neighbors came in trickles, as they do when curiosity outruns prejudice, but pride refuses to admit it. A rider paused at the fence with a wheel that wobbled like a drunk. Robert met him at the gate, lifted the axle in both hands, considered it the way a doctor studies a wound. "What do you charge?" the man asked, eyes flicking past Robert to the shape moving in the doorway behind him. "Fair," Robert said, and left it there. The man nodded, relief and suspicion making a strange marriage on his face, then followed the wheel to the lean-to where Robert kept the kind of order you get only from having lost everything once. Inside, Ailani set a kettle to boil and pulled a jar of crushed willow from the shelf. Her fingers paused over another jar, plantain leaves dried to the color of old money. A knock came, soft, timid, like a bird testing a window it couldn't see. The Pearson boy stood there, not much older than the stone throwers had been, hat crushed in both hands. Behind him, his mother eyes rimmed red hair pinned in a hurry. "She's breathing hot," the woman blurted, words tumbling. "Maggie," the cough came back, then fever. She stopped, swallowing shame. "I heard you make tea." Ailani did not step aside. She stepped toward. "Sit," she said, leading them to the table. "What color are her lips when she coughs?" "Pale," the mother said. "When she sleeps, sometimes blue around the edges." Ailani nodded, mind already arranging leaves and water and time. "Bring her," she said. "Willow mullein, if you can find it along the creek, and steam. Will keep her chest warm, her throat wet, and her room quiet." Pearson nodded too fast, as if gratitude might break something he was trying to hold. He fumbled a coin from his pocket. Ailani shook her head. "Leave eggs," she said, "or time. 2 afternoons mending the fence will pay the rest." The boy's eyes flicked up, surprised by the arithmetic of mercy. "We can do that," he said. His mother didn't speak. The choke in her throat would not let sound through. When they left, Ailani measured bark into the boiling water and breathed in the steam like a woman who trusted what the earth answered when asked right. By noon, the axle lay straight, the wheel trued. The trade settled in nails and a sack of oats. Word moved the way it moves out here, faster than a lie, slower than a bullet, steady as a river that only looks still. By evening, 2 women stood under the cottonwoods, pretending the shade was the reason they had come. "You, the sun-daughter," one asked, not unkind, but not yet brave. The nickname had floated in on other mouths the last week, awkward, at first, then less so. Ailani never said it herself, but she did not deny it when others did. "I make teas," she said. "I show hands how to mend." The older woman turned her palm over, showed a cut that had gone fat around the edges. "A fence wire," she said, embarrassed. "Got mean. Won't close." Ailani washed it. Boiled water again. Crushed plantain with a smooth stone until its veins gave up their secret, laid the green on the wound and bound it with cloth. "Don't pick," she said. "Let your body do its work. Bring me the cloth tomorrow. I'll wash it and give it back clean." The woman's shoulders dropped. Relief is a kind of prayer answered without a church. "What do I owe?" "Tell Maggie's cough to." "Mind me," Ailani said, and smiled, small and real. The woman laughed once, startled, grateful, and left a jar of honey on the table without being asked. Robert watched all of it with the same quiet he brought to tools. A man who had known only how to destroy was learning how to observe repair without reaching for a weapon. He sanded a chair leg smooth, wiped the dust with his palm, and set it aside for the widow Boyd, who had asked if he could make a seat that didn't wobble so prayers wouldn't slide off it on Sundays. By week's end, the woven ring above the window had changed. Threads of blue and yellow gleamed among the dry grass, a ribbon snipped from a girl's dress, and thanks a strip of a man's old work shirt knotted awkwardly by fingers, more used to rope than gifts. The ring did not look grand. It looked lived in. It looked like community, which is never beautiful in the way paintings promise and always beautiful in the way scars are. A storm shouldered in one afternoon, the sky turning the color of old pewter. Wind came first, testing the eaves, then rain with the thick palm of a man who has worked a long time and means to be done. A seam along the new roof lifted. Robert climbed rope at his waist boot, scraping for grip. Ilani braced the ladder with her whole body, rain thrashing her hair loose. Left hand, she shouted above the drum, "Your burn!" He nodded, shifted, drove the peg with his good-armed jaw set. Water ran off the edge and sheeted them both. When he climbed down, she cupped his bandage, checking without touching. "You'll be fine," she said. He wanted to say "we will," but the plural still scared him when he tried to hand it to his mouth. He nodded instead, and that was almost the same. A few nights later, Ruth Garner came. She wore a black scarf tight under her chin, though the air was warm, the sort of woman who keeps grief-bound like hair. She stood at the door a long time before she stepped inside. "I knew your mother," she told Robert without preface. "Not well. Enough to know that name on your ledger wasn't a lie you made because you liked the sound." Robert's breath hitched. "Ma'am," he said, and the word fit his mouth like a memory. Ruth sat hands flat on her knees, the posture of someone giving testimony before no one but herself. "She used to bring bread to my place when my husband took sick, never asked for pay, just brought it, said a name only means something when it's attached to a deed." Her eyes shifted to Ilani. "You carry a name now. Keep it with deeds. That's all anyone can ask, and more than most do." Ilani bowed her head, the gesture small and reverent. "I will," she said. Ruth nodded, pulled a parcel from her basket. "Cloth," she said. "For babies." Her mouth trembled and then stilled. "I sew when I can't sleep. It's for whoever needs it when they need it." "Don't tell me who." Ilani's fingers came up, touched the bundle like blessing. "Thank you." Ruth stood, smoothed her skirt, and left with the awkward grace of a person who has done enough for one day and knows it. At dusk, boys wandered by again, the same three who had thrown stones weeks before. They didn't throw anything this time. They stared at the rebuilt house at the fence, standing straight at the beans climbing like a story that refused to end. "What's that rock say?" the smallest asked, chin pointing to the threshold stone, gone half mossy in the recent rain. "Read it," Ilani said. He frowned, letters fighting him. S-T-A. He paused. "Stay." She nodded. "It's what you do when the wind tells you to run." He looked at her puzzled, then at Robert, then back at the word. He didn't understand, not really, but he touched the stone with 2 fingers as if some part of him already knew he would need a memory like that someday. Robert carved in the evenings now. Not to fill time, time filled itself out here whether you wanted it to or not, but to give it shape. Small things, a horse no taller than a thumb, a smooth oval for a palm to worry. During talk, a bird that didn't look like any bird but felt like one when you held it up to the light. He traded them for flour, or fence time, or nothing at all. The cabin collected them along the shelf like quiet company. One night after the day had run its hard miles, they ate bread with honey and sat on the step, the world falling purple around them. Coyote voices rose and made their usual bargain with the dark. A lantern glowed in the Pearson window across the flat, steady, steady. It didn't waver. "Is she better?" Robert asked. Ilani nodded. Her breath runs smooth now. Her mother said the steam calmed the fear as much as the lungs. She tilted her head. Fear is a sickness, too. It spreads faster than cough. "And the cure company," she said. "Hands doing the same work in the same room, naming the thing that scares you out loud so it can't eat in secret." He took that in. "Let it sit. You can teach that," he asked. She rubbed a bit of honey from her thumb to her palm. "You don't teach it, you make space for it. People do the rest." A long silence. Then quietly he said, "You're making this place bigger than its walls." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The night did it for her, stars opening like stitches in a seam light leaking through. In the days that followed, trades changed shape. A sack of coffee left on the porch at sunup. A pair of hens that simply appeared in the coop and acted like they had always lived there. A mended apron returned with the corner embroidered in a pattern Ilani didn't know and decided to learn. Suspicion did not vanish. It never does. It just runs out of places to sit. A man still spat near the gate once a week, like tithing to his own bitterness. Another rode wide around the property as if kindness carried contagion. But others came and stayed and left lighter. Robert wrote one sentence in a notebook he kept hidden under the coffee tin, the paper rubbed soft at the edges from patience. House stands. She laughed once today and didn't look away when she did. He closed the book like a man banking a small fire he couldn't afford to lose. Ailani added a sprig of sage to the woven ring and a copper button she had found in the ash the day after the fire polished now to a warm, stubborn shine. When the light hit in the late afternoon, the ring winked like an eye that had learned to keep watch without blinking. On a Sunday when the world felt less like a field of knives, Maggie Pearson came herself. She handed Ailani a crooked drawing of the cabin roof, too tall door, too wide, a flower taller than the house growing beside it. "It's your place," she said proudly. "I drew it so I don't forget where to come when my chest hurts." Ailani knelt the drawing trembling in her hands. "Then put it where you can see it every morning," she said. "And remember to breathe like boiling water, slow, even, never all at once." Maggie nodded with the solemnity only children can bring to simple orders, then ran off hair-flying lungs, working. Her mother lingered in the yard, eyes bright with something she didn't have a name for, and waved without daring to speak it. Dusk gathered again. Robert checked the gate a final time. Ailani set the kettle where it could think about heat, while the fire considered the wood. On the threshold, the word on the stone looked darker, as if ink had soaked deeper with each night they obeyed it. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll take the widow Boyd's chair and then help Garner mend her fence. And I'll show Ruth's cloth to the girls," Ailani answered. "We'll cut it into squares and sew them wrong the first time. Then right. Then wrong again for the fun of it." He smiled not with his mouth, but with the skin around his eyes. Sounds like a day. It did. One of those days that looks small from the outside, but from the inside holds the shape of a life. The wind moved over the beans and the corn and the stones. Somewhere out beyond the last fence, another wind was gathering dust with a mean memory riding it. They didn't hear it yet. They couldn't. They heard only the close sounds. A kettle's first whisper. The horse settling into sleep, the floor accepting the weight of two people who had decided to stay. Inside the bowl with the sun and the hand caught a sliver of lamplight and kept it safe until morning. The days slipped into a rhythm, but rhythm on the frontier was never promise, it was warning. Calm always meant someone somewhere was planning to break it. The morning started quiet. Robert split posts behind the shed, his shirt dark with sweat. The steady crack of axe on wood was as familiar to him as a heartbeat. Ailani tended the beans, cupping water in her palms, letting it fall slow at the roots. Her hair had come loose from its braid strands stuck to her cheeks, but she ignored them. Then the sound came. Hooves. Not hurried, measured. One rider. Robert's swing stopped mid-arc. The axe hung in the air a moment, then dropped with a thud into the dirt. He straightened eyes narrowing toward the road. Dust lifted in a thin trail. Ailani saw it too. The water spilled from her palms unnoticed. Her throat tightened. Some part of her already knew. The man rode tall and slow, dressed in black leather, with a scar across his brow like a crooked road. Silver spurs winked in the sun. He dismounted at the edge of the fence as though he owned it. Silas Draper. The name was whispered across saloons and half-finished graves. A man who dealt in property horses, cattle people. A man who believed anything that ran could be chased and anything caught could be kept. His gaze landed on Ailani first. It lingered. She felt her stomach twist. Then he looked at Robert, lips curling into the shadow of a grin. "Afternoon," Draper said, voice like smoke and rust. "Heard you've been keeping something that don't belong to you." Robert's jaw flexed, but his voice came steady. "She's not yours." Draper tilted his head hand, resting light on the pistol at his hip. "Oh, come now. You know how this works. Property's property. She ran. I paid good coin. Fair's fair. I come to collect." Robert took a step forward, axe still at his side. "You leave?" Draper chuckled low and sharp. "Didn't take you for a preacher. Last I checked, you were one of us. Sierra runs. Apache scalps. $50 a head. Didn't matter if it was man, woman, child." Ailani flinched. Her eyes snapped to Robert. The words hit harder than Draper's smirk. Robert's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Funny, ain't it, Draper went on. A man thinks he can build fences high enough, plant beans deep enough, carve names into beams, and the past won't come knocking. But you and me, we don't change. We hunt. We take. It's all we're made for. Robert dropped the axe. It hit the ground with a dull thud. He bent, picked up a shovel instead, longer, heavier. The blade gleamed faintly in the sun. Draper's smirk faltered. His hand slid closer to the gun. Ailani's chest seized. She moved fast, shoving herself between them. Her small frame pressed against Robert's chest, arms flung wide as though she could hold back the storm of two men bred for violence. Don't, she said, her voice breaking desperate. Robert's breathing roared in her ears. His grip on the shovel tightened. For a moment she thought the world would split open right there. But his gaze caught hers. Something shifted. Slowly, painfully, he let the shovel fall. It struck the dirt with a hollow, final sound. Draper exhaled through his nose a laugh that wasn't laughter. You've gone soft, Hale. She's got fire, I'll give her that. But fire don't make her yours. She's mine. Always was. Robert's voice came rough, steady. She's not mine. She's free. Draper spat into the dirt, eyes narrowing. Ain't no such thing for her kind. He swung back into the saddle, reined his horse. You'll regret this, both of you. Then he rode off, dust curling like smoke behind him. Robert stood unmoving, chest-heaving eyes on the horizon where Draper vanished. Ailani pressed her hand to his arm. He didn't shake her off. Instead, he turned slowly, walked to the far edge of the property. There, where the soil lay soft from spring rain, he dug. He dug until sweat poured, until blisters burst on his palms. He dug until the hole was wide deep. Then he laid the shovel in it, covered it with his bare hands, pressed the dirt down hard as though sealing something away forever. Ailani stood a distance back, arms wrapped around herself. When he finished, he didn't look at her. He only walked back to the house, hands stained, brown face, unreadable. That night, when he entered the cabin, something waited on the table, a cup of cool water, and beside it a flat stone, on its face drawn in ash a spiral, not an end, not a curse, but a beginning. Robert stared at it, throat tight. For the first time in years, he had buried a weapon and not meant to dig it up again. Sleep broke like a bad board. One crack. Then everything gave. Robert woke with his breath tearing out of him, hands, already fisting eyes, hunting a battlefield that wasn't there. The cabin held no guns, no riders, no smoke, only the slow glow of the coals and the small sounds a house makes when it has finally learned your name. Across the room, Ailani pushed up on her elbows, heart sprinting. He'd made no sound a neighbor would have heard, but she heard it the way men cry without a voice, the way ghosts pull a ribcage apart from the inside. Robert, she said, soft as willow shadow. It's here, not there. He sat, palms braced on his thighs, staring at the floor like it was a map, and he was lost on it. Sweat slicked his neck. The bandage on his forearm had loosened where he'd pulled at it in sleep. She crossed to him and poured water without asking. The tin cup kissed the table. Steam rose from the kettle in thin prayers. He didn't take the cup. He looked at his hands instead, like they might confess if he glared hard enough. They were under the bed, he said, finally, voice rough. Boots. Hers. Little ones. I kept them there to remember to clean them. Before Sunday. Before... He stopped. The words tripped over something he refused to step on. Ailani held the cup out until he took it. When he drank, the water steadied its way down his chest like it knew the route better than he did. Tell me their names, she said. He swallowed. His throat worked. Lena, he said, and Rowan. He was 4. Thought the horses were dragons. Argued with the sun when it went down because he hadn't finished building his fort. The corner of his mouth twitched as if it might try for a smile and then remembered itself. The night they died. I was a mile out, he went on. Checking a snare, I heard screaming and ran until my lungs quit on me. It was already a fever breaking, hot air rushing out. I pulled what I could. It wasn't enough. It never is. His fingers tightened around the cup until the metal groaned. I signed on after he said, Scouts, then the bounty. Told myself I was making the world safer for men like me. For boys like... He cut the name off with his teeth. It wasn't justice. It was arithmetic. Hurt for hurt. Each tally made me less. The fire cracked. Ailani's hand moved slowly so he could refuse it if he needed to, and rested on the table near his. Not touching, inviting. I know what the arithmetic feels like, she said. It starts with belonging to someone who says they saved you, and ends with you not belonging to yourself. He turned his head eyes finding hers as if needing to confirm she was not the past wearing a new face. She didn't look away. Outside, the wind stirred the cottonwoods until their leaves sounded like 1,000 small yeses. He unclenched his fingers. Some of the iron in his shoulders melted. Sleep if you can, she said. We can chase the rest in the morning. He didn't argue. He lay down not because he believed rest would come, but because she had offered it like a flat stone in a creek, something to step on to reach the other side. He slept without drowning. Morning wore the smell of wet wood and coffee. A thin fog clung to the pasture like the land had pulled a sheet over itself to cool down. Robert went to the fence with a hammer and the patience you use when you're mending something that keeps breaking. Each nail he set was a breath forced through a stubborn chest. Ailani sorted jars, plantain, willow, yarrow. She set out a small pot of honey and a stack of clean cloths, tied her braids back, then untied them again and started over. Her hands were busy in the way a heart is when it's trying not to think too loud. By noon, the air had burned off its damp. They ate on the step-bred onion the last of the stew. Robert chewed like the work of it might keep his mind from turning in on itself. She studied him a long moment, then said, "When I ran, I told you I did not want to belong to them. I said, let me belong to you instead. I don't mean belong like a rope. I mean belong like a name over a door you're not afraid to walk through." He nodded once, like a man accepting a law. "I love someone," she said, as if the sentence itself was a door she had not walked through in a long time. "Before I ever spoke your name out loud, before I knew what this house smelled like." He wasn't a man yet, but he had hands like river stones, smooth where they should have been sharp. His name was Tasso. Robert kept still. Even the air felt like it had leaned in. "They took me after a raid," she continued. "I thought I knew what would happen. I had heard the stories since I had ears to hear, but the pain didn't come. Not that way. I found water and food and a blanket lined with fur. I found someone who sat near the fire when I cried and didn't try to stop it or make it his. He didn't know my words. I didn't know his." He touched his chest and said a word that sounded like horse. There was a scar there, horseshoe-shaped, left by a soldier's bayonet when he was a boy. "Soldier," he said, and then he touched my heart and shook his head. "Not soldier." The wind sent one dry leaf skittering across the yard. It sounded like a tiny hoof. One night he said, "You are not a thing, you are someone's sky." He didn't say his sky, just someone's. He kissed me like a person, not like an owner. We had 3 nights that felt like the world had slipped its rope. Then dawn came, dressed in blue coats. The camp turned to shouting. I remember dirt in my mouth and the taste of iron where I bit my tongue. I screamed his name. He didn't answer. Her jaw tightened. She didn't cry. The hurt was old, and old hurts have learned to sit without spilling. When they brought me back to a room with no windows, men argued over what I was. The argument never included me. Then I ran. I have been running ever since. Robert stared at the yard, at the place where he had buried the shovel. He knew a door when he heard it open. Sometimes it's a scream, sometimes it's a confession. "I shot a boy once," he said. "The year after I lost them. A river crossing north of the Sierras. He ran the shallows like he knew the rocks by name. He turned once to look back and the wind caught his shirt. I saw a scar, here." His hand touched his chest, left of center. "Horseshoe." I thought it was a sign. I told myself it meant we were the same. Both marked. I squeezed the trigger like a man putting down a rabid dog. He fell without sound. The water made all the noise for him. Ailani's breath caught. Not a cry. A sucked-in, shredded thing that could have been pain or understanding. The world narrowed to 2 people and the space between them. The beans, the fence, the cottonwoods, All of it waited to hear which direction the next word would turn. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the dirt as if it too might judge and be right to do it. I have not said that out loud. He finished the words small clean. Not to the men I drank with after. Not to the men I hunted with. Saying it makes it more true. But I think it was always true. A long silence. Crickets started up as if they had been late to a job they did every day. Finally, Ailani spoke. Her voice was even, which is not the same as soft. Maybe it was him. Maybe it wasn't. The river has a way of taking faces and giving them back as shapes. But the thing you're carrying is not his name. It's yours. He closed his eyes. The look on his face was a man lowering a load off his spine and discovering the ground is not what it used to be. If it was him, she said, then the first love I ever chose died by the hand of the man who would one day choose me without a rope. What do we do with that? He opened his eyes. Met hers. Bury the weapon. He said, voice unsteady but walking. Not the truth. She nodded once. The word on the threshold stone flared in her mind as bright as fire without the heat. Stay, she said quietly. He looked toward the door, then back to her. I want to, he said. She let out a breath she had been holding since the river years. If we let Draper's voice sit in this house, he gets what he wanted without lifting a gun. Let him ride the road alone. We plant, we mend. We say the names we need to say, and we don't let them turn into knives. He reached across the step and set his palm over hers. No ceremony, no preacher, just weight and warmth and a promise that wasn't wrapped in pretty words, because pretty words blow away. I can't bring him back, Robert said. I can't take back the shot. You can spend your days paying forward what you owe, she answered. Not with blood, with bread, with fences, with chairs that don't wobble, with a house where a girl can breathe without asking permission. The sun had slid west while they talked. Shadows stretched the yard into long, thin truths. A hawk circled. The horse flicked at flies and decided the day had not meant him harm. Inside the beam with her name held the roof. She went to it now, stood beneath the carved letters, and laid her palm flat against them. Robert joined her. His hand covered the place where hers had rested moments before a blessing passed back and forth without needing a priest. Tonight, she said, I'll brew willow for the sleep, and mullein for the breath, and we'll leave the door open until the cabin smells like rain. And tomorrow, he said, I'll take the garner fence, then bring Ruth's cloth to the girls. Then I'll fix the latch on our door because it sticks, and because there are things I can fix. Something like a smile moved across her mouth, quick and real. Good, she said. It's a long list. It'll keep you alive. He huffed a laugh that remembered how to be one. The sound warmed the rafters. Even the stove sat taller. Later, when the dark leaned against the windows, they lit only one lamp. They didn't need more. They ate bread with honey. She told him how Tasso had taught her the word for sky. He told her how Rowan had misnamed every animal on purpose just to hear him laugh. They did not try to tidy the stories into a lesson. They let them be messy and human and sharp around the edges. Before sleep, she took the woven ring from the window and added one thread blue, the color of a river that forgives nothing and everything. She hung it back up. He banked the coals, watched them lower themselves into their own red breathing. On the threshold, the stone kept its word. Stay. They did, not because the past had vanished, but because together they had decided the past would not be given the right to evict them again. Outside, the cottonwoods talked in their leaf language. Inside, two people listened, and for a long, still minute, nothing begged for anything except the next breath. The season turned with the kind of slowness that sneaks up on you. One day the corn leaves looked dull and tired, and the next morning they were gold. The air sharpened, not cruel but insistent, telling everyone it was time to gather in to hold close. Robert stacked wood by the fence line straight as soldiers. Ailani hung strings of dried herbs from the rafters, each bunch tied with her own hands. Willow bark, sage, yarrow, chamomile. The cabin began to smell less like ash, more like medicine and bread. Neighbors came more often, some with coughs, some with broken chairs, some just with excuses. They sat by the hearth while Ailani crushed leaves into paste or poured steaming water over roots. Robert would hover near the wall, not speaking unless asked, sanding wood with the same patience he once carried into a battlefield. People left lighter, some left smiling, and slowly the word son-daughter spread. It slipped into conversations at the store, into whispers at the well. At first it carried suspicion, but suspicion wears itself out when it runs into gratitude too many times. Maggie Pearson's mother said the name with reverence now. The widow Boyd stitched it into a quilt corner in thread so fine it could only be found by touch. Ailani heard it, but she never used it herself. She just tucked the sound into the woven ring above the window, where every new thread and ribbon carried a story. One evening, the air shifted. The sky blushed red long before the sun was ready to sleep. Ailani was mending a dress by the fire when Robert came in, his shoulders stiff. He set a bundle wrapped in burlap on the table. The weight of it thudded like a heart. "What's that?" she asked, laying her needle aside. "Something I should have done long ago," he said. His voice carried grit, but also a kind of trembling he couldn't sand down. He unwrapped the burlap. Inside lay a rifle. His. The one that had followed him from the raids. The one that had taken more names than he dared count. Its stock was worn smooth, the metal still oiled as if it had been waiting. Ailani's breath caught. Her hands stilled in her lap. Robert stared at it, his jaw hard. "I carried this like it was part of me, slept beside it, ate with it near. I told myself it kept me alive. Truth is, it kept me dead." He reached for the door. "Come with me." She followed, her heart pounding. Outside, the night air bit at their skin and the stars stretched cold and endless above. He walked to the garden, to the place where he had buried the shovel. The dirt there was soft, a scar that had never fully healed. Without a word, he knelt and began to dig. His hands broke the earth, slow, deliberate, the way a man digs a grave, not for someone else, but for the part of himself he no longer wants to carry. When the hole was wide enough, he laid the rifle inside. The metal caught a sliver of moonlight, then disappeared under the first scoop of dirt. His hands trembled, but he didn't stop. He buried it deep, pressing the earth down flat with his palms. When he was done, he sat back on his heels, breathing hard. Ailani knelt beside him. For a long time, they just sat in the silence. The earth smelled raw and new, like something waiting to grow. Robert's voice broke it. "I don't know who I am without it." Ailani placed her hand over his, pressing both palms to the fresh mound. "You're the man who put it down," she said. "That's who." He looked at her, eyes shining in the dim. Then he nodded once, slow the way a man nods when he knows the truth is too heavy to argue with. They returned to the cabin. Inside, the fire burned steady, patient. The bowl with the painted sun glowed faint on the table. Ailani touched it as she passed, the warmth grounding her. Robert lingered by the door, his shadow stretched tall against the wall. "You gave me something I didn't ask for," he said quietly. "A second chance. A name that isn't soaked in blood. I don't know how to give that back." She turned, meeting his eyes. "You don't give it back," she said. "You live it." For a long moment, the only sound was the crack of the fire, the slow whistle of the kettle. Then Robert stepped forward, closer to her. His hand lifted, hesitated, then brushed one braid from her cheek. It wasn't possession. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. Her breath trembled, but she didn't step away. She leaned into the touch, eyes closing for just a heartbeat. When she opened them again, he had already stepped back, giving her space, his face unreadable. But his hand lingered in the air as if it still remembered the shape of her. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the woven ring sway faintly in the draft. The ribbons and threads caught moonlight, small sparks in the dark. Her fingers traced the copper button tied into it, warm from memory. Outside, the land lay quiet. But in the distance, faint on the horizon, a dust trail stirred. Not a storm. Riders. Coming slow, deliberate. She pressed her forehead to the glass, her breath fogging it. The word on the threshold stone glimmered faint beneath the moonlight. "Stay." She whispered it to herself, to the land, to him, and to the dark coming closer. The town had a way of talking with its teeth, words chewed slow, spit far. By the time they reached the Hale homestead, they tasted nothing like the truth. Crops don't rise that fast unless something unholy pulls them, a rancher told the blacksmith, not looking up from his nails. "Girl's got tricks," another said. "Witch strings in her window, a bowl with a sun painted right in the middle like she thinks she's God." A grocer's wife folded her arms. "Name's Black," he says. "Cherokee blood, Apache hands. That's 2 curses before breakfast." The blacksmith kept hammering until the nail head flared flat. He didn't argue. He also didn't agree. That's how you survive small towns. You let the anvil do most of your talking. By week's end, the fence at the Hale place had new footprints pressed into the dust where men had come close enough to look mean, and then remembered they were cowards. Elani felt the talk before she heard it. Talk has a pressure. It pushes on a house the way wind does testing seams listening for weakness. She tightened the woven ring with 2 fresh threads, one red, one river blue. Cleaned the table until the wood remembered its grain. Laid out her jars like soldiers who meant to defend without drawing blood. Robert stacked wood slow and exact. He'd buried the rifle 2 nights before. The mound had settled an honest scar. Every time his eyes caught it, something in his shoulders loosened, then tightened again. Quitting a weapon is not the same thing as forgetting why you learned it in the first place. Late afternoon, the sky went the color of tarnished copper. Heat wobbled above the hardpan. A horse whickered at nothing and then at everything. Hoofbeats. 3 men rode in abreast and stopped at the gate as if they had practiced the pose. Hats low, dust high. Rifles slung casual. Robert didn't reach for anything. There was nothing to reach for but tools. He walked to the fence with empty hands. Ilani moved to the doorway and stood in the shadow where sun couldn't find her eyes. She was not hiding. She was choosing her ground. The man in the middle had a gray mustache like a broom and a jaw that liked deciding things it hadn't thought through. Kerrigan owned 20 head and 3 opinions he never changed. To his left, Cal Turner, young enough to be dumb, old enough to be dangerous. To the right, Jasper Oates, whose laugh never reached his eyes. Kerrigan leaned an elbow on the saddle horn. "Afternoon hail," he said, as if the word itself were a threat. "Heard some talk. Came to see if there's anything that needs correcting." Robert set his forearms lightly on the top rail. "Fence is straight," he said. "Gate swings clean." Oates spat near the post. "Not the kind we meant." Cal Turner's gaze flicked to the window where the woven ring swung once in a breeze that wasn't there. "Witch signs," he muttered. "She's put a hex on the soil. Beans climb too fast. Folks go there and come back different." Ilani's mouth thinned. "Different. Yes. Alive." Kerrigan ignored the ring. His eyes were on the threshold stone where the carved word had gone dark with weather. He pointed with his chin. "What's that say?" Robert didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the men. "Read it." Kerrigan scowled. "Don't play schoolmaster with me. It says stay." Ilani's voice carried from the doorway, calm as a pond. She stepped forward 1 pace enough for light to collect along her cheekbones. "It's what we do here." Oates' mouth curled. "What you do here, girl, is stir up decent folks' peace. Peace that breaks when a cough comes," she said, "wasn't peace." Cal Turner shifted in his saddle. He hadn't expected her to answer. He hadn't expected her voice to be steady. He looked to Kerrigan for a cue. Kerrigan nudged his horse closer to the fence until iron squeaked against pine. "You listen, Hale," he said. "Men say you were a good shot. Steady hand in the Sierra business, not a man to cross. But then you fetch an Apache girl out of a hole, and all of a sudden your garden's jumping, and the women in this county are brewing weeds instead of buying tonics. It ain't natural. It ain't proper." Robert's fingers spread on the rail, knuckles unwhite. "Natural's what grows," he said. "Proper's what keeps a child's fever from taking her." Oates snorted. "Talk like a preacher long enough, you'll forget what you are. A killer's a killer no matter how many chairs he sands." Robert blinked slow. "Then I know killers when I see them," he said. "And I know what makes them stop." Kerrigan's mouth twitched. He took it for an insult. He was half right. Cal Turner's impatience broke first. He swung his leg over and dropped to the ground, boots puffing dust. He planted both hands on the top rail like he meant to push the fence down with posture alone. "Look," he said, trying to find a tone between threat and plea, "we ain't here to shoot. We're here to warn. You give her a day to pack up and go. Head east. Head anywhere. Just not here. Folks'll let it lie if you do the sensible thing." Ilani tilted her head. The sensible thing would be what exactly? Leave the sick to cough. Leave the hungry to buy bread they can't afford. Leave a man to bury his house a second time without hands to lift beams. Cal shifted his weight. Words had not been part of his plan. Kerrigan cut in. "We don't owe you answers, girl. We owe our wives calm and our Sunday fields their quiet. You carry noise. Robert straightened a fraction. He did not puff his chest. He did not make himself big. He made himself plain. You came to my fence to tell me to unmake what we made, he said. You brought rifles as punctuation. Oates' hand drifted toward his sling. In the doorway, Ailani's breath caught a small sound, but it found Robert like a thread finds a needle's eye. He lifted both hands from the fence and showed them empty, slow, deliberate, the gesture of a man walking into church without a hat. Shoot me now if you mean to, he said with no heat in it. If not, hear me. Silence slouched down off the saddles and stood between them. I don't carry a rifle anymore, Robert went on. I put it in the ground. The earth is better for it. If you pull yours, make sure the sermon you preach with it is one your sons can live with when the barrel's cold. A sparrow landed on the rail between them, cocked its head, and bounced away. Even foolish birds understand standoffs. Kerrigan's jaw worked. He had not come for a sermon. He had come for a scene. But scenes require participants, and Hale refused to play his part. You think you can shame me, Kerrigan barked. I got nothing to be shamed about. Then you won't mind telling Ruth Garner you kept the girl away the night her boy's breath turned to gravel, Ailani said, not moving. Or telling Maggie Pearson that the cough she beat must have been witch work. Or telling the widow Boyd you'd rather her chair wobble until her prayers spill because a woman with brown hands steadied it. Cal Turner looked at his boots. Jasper Oates looked at the road. Kerrigan flared. Don't you put neighbors in your mouth like shields. I put names where harm can hear them, she replied. If harm is honest, it leaves. Oates swore under his breath. This is foolish, he muttered. We look like boys come to tip a hen house. Cal cleared his throat. Hale, he said, softer. Men said Draper's got a burr in for you. He doesn't forgive being told no. He won't forget you buried a shovel in the ground where he could see you. We ain't Draper. We're just tired of hearing our wives say son-daughter when they mean miracle. Ailani's eyes softened in a way that did not surrender. Miracle is what you call work. You didn't see, she said. Robert kept his hands where they could all see them. Turn around, he told the three. Go home. If Draper comes, he'll find a fence and 2 people who won't run. If you come back with him, that's a choice you'll have to sleep with. Oates shifted in the saddle. I sleep fine, he lied. But even lies know when to quit. Kerrigan worked his jaw again, found no fight in his mouth worth spitting. He gathered his reins. Last warning, he said the kind of phrase men use when they have run out of real ones. Men don't like change. Men don't like mirrors, Robert answered. They prefer windows. They can look out and count other folks' sins. For a second, Ailani thought Kerrigan would swing, but rage like any tool needs skill. He didn't have it. He clicked his tongue, turned his horse. Cal followed. Oates looked once more at the ring in the window, then at the mound of dirt beyond the garden. He knew a grave when he saw one. He didn't know what it contained. He decided not to ask. They rode away. Not fast. Not triumphant. Like men who had set out to drag a wolf and come home with their own leashes in their hands. The yard breathed. It did not know it had been holding its chest until now. Robert let his palms fall from the air. They shook after the way muscles tremble once the mountain is already behind you. Ailani came to the fence. Close, but not touching. He looked at her. She looked at him. Words were a waste on moments like that. A crow dropped onto the rail where Kerrigan's elbow had been and tilted its head. It cawed once, as if to mark attendance, then flapped off board. Inside the kettle had begun its soft talk. Ailani crossed the yard and lifted it, poured steaming water over willow for him, over chamomile for herself. When she set the cup down in front of him, her hand brushed his knuckles. He didn't pull away. He also didn't hold on. Sometimes the miracle is in the restraint. They'll say I made you soft, she said. He huffed a breath that had the shape of a laugh. You made me unarmed, he said. Soft is what you call a wall that doesn't cut your hands when you lean on it. She studied him. The man who had once measured his worth in scalps. The man who had buried a shovel, a rifle, a temper. You did it, she said almost to herself. You really did it. You stayed standing without steel. He nodded toward the threshold. The stone said to. She found the ghost of a smile. Stones don't talk, they do, he said. You just have to carve the right mouth into them. Wind moved the beans on the trellis like a choir swaying to a hymn not everyone knew yet. Over the ridge a dust line lingered, thin, uncertain news, carrying itself like a snake that needed sun. As dusk pulled its blanket over the day, a small voice came from the road. Maggie Pearson. She ran up hair wild, clutching a folded paper. Miss Ellie, she chirped, using the name she'd misheard, and kept because it felt like a nickname the world might treat kindly. Ilani had not corrected her. Ellen had been the ledger. Ilani had been the girl who ran. Ellie could be the woman who stayed. Maggie held out the paper. A drawing. 3 stick horses, a big square house, a ring in the window like a round sun. On the door in careful crooked letters. Stay, for your wall, Maggie said, proud. So you remember. In case you forget. Ilani crouched and took it with both hands. Thank you, she said, the words heavier than the paper. Will you tell your mother I'll bring cough syrup tomorrow? Maggie nodded. Already turned half away. Already running. Already safe. Robert watched the girl go, then looked at the drawing. Ellie, he said, trying the shape of it in his mouth. She looked up. If you want it, he added. She weighed the sound, felt how it sat in her chest. Not a chain, not a mask. A name with a door in it. I do, she said. Night came kind. They ate bread with honey again because sometimes sweetness is the only argument worth making after a day full of hard talk. He fixed the latch that had been catching. She stitched a tear in the curtain. Small repairs, sacraments without a church. Before sleep, Ellie stood under the beam and traced the letters of her name, carved there. They felt deeper than the day he'd cut them, as if staying wears a groove into wood the way rivers write their names in stone. Robert banked the coals and glanced once toward the dark mound where the rifle lay. He didn't need to check it. He needed to remember it. Tomorrow, he said, I'll take a chair to the widow Boyd, then mend Garner's gate. And I'll steep syrup for Maggie, then show Ruth's cloth to the girls, Ellie answered. The plans lay between them like a map to a country people insist doesn't exist. They knew better. Far off thunder spoke low, a rumor rolling the hills. Closer, the word on the threshold held its place. Stay. They did. And when sleep came, it found 2 people unarmed, unafraid, and just for a few hours untouched by other men's unfinished business. In the dark beyond the cottonwoods, a different rider turned his horse toward the Hale place and smiled a quiet, mean smile only the night could see. But that was the night's story to carry forward. This day had already said what it came to say. The storm didn't come with thunder first. It came with smell. Smoke sharp, oily, riding low like a thief. Robert stirred awake hair, prickling lungs catching. Beside the hearth, Ellie bolted upright. Her nose wrinkled. Her whisper was a blade. Do you smell gasoline? He was already on his feet. Out the back. Now. They grabbed nothing. Not the bowl, not the jars, not even shoes. Only themselves. The first window shattered as they reached the trap door hidden beneath the root shelf. Heat slapped the room in a rush. Robert hauled the hatch open. Ellie slid in without hesitation, the earth swallowing her whole. He followed, dragging the door closed just as flame poured along the ceiling like breath. The crawl was blind. Dirt pressed against their elbows, their knees. Roots scratched at their hair. Ellie led by feel. She had traced this tunnel weeks ago when he first told her of it, never imagining it would be more than a story. Now it was the difference between ash and heartbeat. They spilled out beneath the brush line near the ridge, gasping filthy. Behind them, the roof caved with a roar. Sparks lifted into the night like crazed fireflies. From the bushes, they watched the home burn. Laughter carried across the flames. Draper's men silhouettes stomping the porch beams, rifles swinging loose. One kicked the stacked firewood and howled. Another pissed on the garden until steam hissed from the soil. Ellie clutched Robert's sleeve, her nails digging. He didn't move. His body was rigid, eyes locked on the blaze. The reflection made him look like the man he used to be, jaw-set gaze, merciless, chest heaving like a furnace. They came back, he muttered, voice low, hollow. They took everything again. She pulled at him, desperate. They'll keep coming if you let them. Robert, look at me. But he didn't. He stared until the riders swung away into the dark, leaving nothing but cinders and a howl that wasn't coyote. It was memory. They waited for dawn. Neither slept, neither spoke. When light bled across the horizon, what remained of the cabin stood like blackened bones. The chimney crooked, the timbers warped, the threshold stones still visible under a skin of ash. Robert sank onto what used to be the step. The wood crumbled beneath him. His fists knotted in his lap. His face was unreadable, which made it worse. "We had nothing," he said at last. "We built something. Now it's gone again." Ellie picked her way across the wreckage, careful where she set her feet. She bent, lifted a stone blackened by flame, felt its weight. Then she found his pocket knife half buried in ash, the one he used for fence posts for carving her name into the beam. She scratched a single word into the scorched stone. "Stay." She carried it back to the threshold and laid it where the door had once swung open. Then she looked at him, eyes burning not with tears but with something harder. This land was burnt before she said, "We made it bloom. We will again." His mouth twitched, not a smile, not yet, but something fighting for air. "You still believe that I have to," she answered. "Because if we don't, they win." He stared at the stone, at the ash, at her. His shoulders sagged, a man folding under too many weights. "I don't know if I can do it again," he admitted. "Start over. Watch it fall again." Ellie stepped closer, close enough to place her hand over his. "You don't have to do it for me," she said. "Do it so you can say they didn't break you." His fingers trembled. He turned his palm, caught hers, held on, like a man who had forgotten how until that moment. They stood together in the ruin, two figures charred at the edges, upright anyway. That evening, while the coals still glowed faint in the wreckage, Ellie began stacking unburnt stones where the garden fence used to stand. She said nothing, but each motion was deliberate reclaiming. Robert sat watching. The word "stay" gleamed faint behind her in the ash. When she returned and sat beside him, the stars revealed themselves more visible without a roof to hide them. And for the first time in weeks, when Robert closed his eyes, he did not dream of war. He dreamed of rain. The rain answered his dream. 2 nights after the fire, it came soft at first, then steady, soaking the ash until steam rose from the earth. Robert stood in it, bareheaded, shirt plastered to his back. Ellie lifted her arms and let drops run down her face, washing soot from her skin. Neither sought shelter. They let the storm write a new story on the land. Each drop was a vow not all flames consume some cleanse. By dawn the ground drank deeply. Charred beams glistened black. The air smelled of wet clay instead of smoke. The ruin felt less like a grave and more like soil waiting to be turned. Rebuilding began with what their hands could carry. Robert pried nails from scorched planks, hammered them straight on a stone, stacked the usable wood. Ellie dragged stones from the old chimney, wiping them clean before piling them neat. Side by side, they moved like two halves of the same stubborn rhythm. By midsummer, a frame rose. 4 posts, a roof beam, rough walls of mismatched timber. It wasn't much, but it caught shadows and gave them shape. That first night, they strung canvas over the frame, lit a small fire beneath it, and shared bread. Smoke drifted through holes in the roof, but the warmth was real. Ellie looked up at the beam above them. Robert was there too, carving slow, deliberate strokes with his pocket knife, her name etched into the pine. She touched it, fingertips trembling. "I've never seen it written in wood before," she whispered. He didn't meet her eyes. "Now it holds the roof up." Her chest tightened. Not from grief. From something unfamiliar but steady. Belonging. As weeks passed, the house stood taller. Not grand, but whole enough to keep rain out and fire in. The chimney puffed again, stone by stone. The hearth glowed red, the smell of stew replacing smoke. Neighbors drifted by, some curious, some bitter. They saw Ellie bent over herbs, Robert mending fences, the cabin standing where it had been burned. They muttered curses under their breath, but fewer than before. Even bitterness knows when it's wasting its voice. Robert's hands turned busy for the county chairs for the widow Boyd, a mended wagon axle for a farmer too old to lift. He charged fair-spoke, little-worked, honest. Ellie gathered the women. At first they came hesitant, eyes darting, then more drawn by cornbread, by the warm hush of the hearth, by the calm weight in her voice. She showed them willow bark for coughs, walnut dye for cloth, small stitches for big wounds, Children lingered. Mothers followed. Whispers shifted. They began calling her son-daughter. Not runaway. Not cursed. Son-daughter. The name fit like morning light. One evening, Robert came home with a burlap bundle. He set it on the table, silent. Ellie untied it, breath-catching. A bowl. Handmade clay, uneven glaze, rough at the rim. But inside, painted in ochre, was a sun. Beneath it, a hand. Her throat closed. She looked at him. He rubbed the back of his neck, awkward. "It's not much," he said. "Just thought it might belong here." She touched the glaze. "It does." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. She placed it in the center of the table and pressed her forehead to his the way her mother once did to say thank you. Outside, the last of daylight slipped gold over the hills. Inside, the house hummed, not with fear, not with fire, with choice. That night, Ellie hung another ribbon on the woven ring by the window. Blue, the color of rivers that remember everything but still keep flowing. The wind caught it and made it dance. And in the quiet, she whispered one word to herself, to the house, to him. Stay. And for the first time since she had run, it didn't feel like a prayer. It felt like truth. The land listened when they worked it. By autumn, green had crawled back into the black earth. Stubborn shoots pushing through ash, squash vines sprawled along the fence beams, climbed rough twine, corn stood in uneven rows, but tall all the same. Every stalk was a declaration: fire does not have the final word. Robert built without stopping. A chair for Mrs. Boyd. A gate for the Garners. A cradle for a neighbor's new baby, the wood sanded so smooth it caught sunlight like water. He carved names into beams and handles, quiet marks of permanence. The county began to murmur Hale's hands mend more than wood. Ellie. Ellie now, because Maggie Pearson had misnamed her once, and the word had stuck in Robert's mouth like it belonged there, kept to the hearth. Children spilled across the cabin floor wide-eyed as she taught them to stitch to steep roots for coughs, to braid sage for protection. At first their mothers lingered only at the edges, arms crossed, suspicious. But suspicion weakens against warm bread and steady hands. Soon they sat two, sewing, laughing, listening. The name son-daughter spread wider, not whispered as threat, but as gratitude. And Ellie wore it without speaking it herself. She wore it like sunlight wears the fields. One night as the fire burned low, Robert carried in another burlap bundle. He unwrapped it with slow fingers. A rifle gleamed. The one he had carried since the raids, oiled and clean, waiting like a ghost in the corner. Ellie's chest tightened. Her eyes searched his face. Robert stared at the weapon, jaw set. "I carried this longer than I carried any promise," he said. "It kept me breathing, but it kept me dead. Time to put it where it belongs." He walked to the mound by the garden, the place where the shovel lay buried. With bare hands, he dug slow, deliberate. The earth yielded cool and damp. When the hole was ready, he laid the rifle inside. Moonlight kissed the barrel once before dirt swallowed it. He pressed the soil flat with both palms. His shoulders sagged. His chest rose and fell. "I don't know who I am without it," he admitted. Ellie knelt beside him, her hand pressing over his. "You're the man who put it down," she said. "That's who." They sat there until the night folded quiet around them. Inside the cabin smelled of bread and herbs. The bowl with the sun and hand sat in the middle of the table. Ellie touched it as she passed, grounding herself. Robert lingered by the doorway, his shadow long. "You gave me something I didn't ask for," he said. "A second chance. A name that isn't drenched in blood. I don't know how to pay that back." She turned her gaze steady. "You don't give it back. You live it." For a long breath only, the fire spoke. Then Robert stepped closer, close enough for his hand to brush a braid from her cheek. Not possession, not pity. Recognition. Her breath trembled, but she didn't step away. She leaned into the touch for a heartbeat. When he pulled back, the air between them felt different, like a space no one else could walk into. Later, sleep wouldn't come. Ellie sat by the window watching the woven ring sway faint in the draft. Each ribbon told a story. She had added a new one tonight, deep red, the color of earth under fingernails. Beyond the field, she saw it. A dust trail on the horizon, faint but real. Not storm, riders, coming slow, coming certain. Her hand pressed against the glass, breath fogging it. The threshold stone glimmered faintly, below words still visible even under ash and mud. "Stay!" She whispered it into the night, a promise against the dark that drew nearer. They felt the riders before they heard them, a pressure in the air, a hush in the birds, the kind of quiet a land makes when it's bracing for boots. Dawn had only just pushed a pale seam along the ridge. Ellie stood at the window palm on the glass, watching the woven ring move in the faint draft. She'd added a red thread in the night tight as a vein. Behind her, Robert pulled on his shirt, the fabric stiff from yesterday's work, the collar smelling of smoke and soap. Neither spoke. They had already said the only word that mattered. "Stay!" Hoofbeats stitched themselves toward the house, slow, deliberate, a confident rider setting the tempo, and others falling in line. Robert stepped onto the porch without a hat, without a belt, without a rifle, to pretend he still owned. Ellie followed him to the doorway and took the shadow. Her shadow this time. Chosen ground. 11 riders eased out of the low light like a rumor deciding to be fact. Silas Draper sat in the center as if he believed the earth was a chair made for him. To his left, Kerrigan with his broom mustache. To his right, Cal Turner trying hard not to look young. 2 men from town Robert didn't know by name, and 3 who wore their guns like they'd been born wearing them. They drew up at the fence and let their horses breathe. The dust settled over the beams, over the posts, over the threshold stone that held its one stubborn word. Draper smiled the kind a knife might make if it had lips. "Mornin' hail," he drawled. "Fine sky to end a mistake under." Robert placed his forearms on the top rail. He did not match the smile. He did not pretend fear wasn't in him. He only made room beside it for something larger. "What is it you've come for that Ash didn't already take?" he asked. Draper's gaze slid to the doorway, to the shape in the shadow there. He didn't bother with politeness. Her. Ellie didn't move. Her hands were empty. Her shoulders were not. "You don't get to collect people like strays," Robert said. "Not here." Kerrigan snorted. "Not your call, Hale. Property's property. You know that better than most. You made wages off it." "Not anymore," Robert said. "Anymore" is a church word Draper mocked. "Men like us are made of yesterdays. I brought papers." He flicked his wrist, and a folded sheet appeared, waved like a flag. A bill of sale. 2 signatures. A seal that pretended to be law. Ellie spoke from the doorway, voice steady. "The man who stamped that seal never saw my face. He saw a price. I am not a price." Cal Turner shifted in the saddle. His eyes skittered between Draper and the door and the word on the stone. He remembered Maggie's cough easing under steam. He remembered his own mother's hand bandaged and painless by morning. A flush climbed his neck as if conscience were a fever. "Papers don't hold here," Robert said. "Only choices do." Draper laughed low. "Then choose. Step aside and we'll be done before the coffee cools." Robert lifted both hands from the rail and held them where every man could see. Empty. Unarmed. A sermon without a pulpit. "I won't raise steel to you," he said. "I won't let you cross my gate. If you shoot, you shoot an unarmed man on his porch in front of a woman who has outlived too many fires to count." A muscle jumped in Draper's jaw. "That sounds like a dare." "It's a mirror," Robert answered. "Look in it before you decide what kind of man you want to be when the dust settles." A stir rose behind the riders, another dust thread joining the first. Hooves again lighter. A wagon creaked into sight along the track by the cottonwoods. Not more guns. Women, children, neighbors. Ruth Garner on the bench seat, black scarf neat as a wound. The widow Boyd with her hands clenched white in her lap. Maggie Pearson's mother holding Maggie by the shoulders so the girl wouldn't run ahead. 2 boys from the far section with their hats crushed flat and their eyes wide. They didn't come armed. They came witnessed. The wagon rolled to a stop a stone's throw behind the riders. Ruth Garner's voice carried thin but iron true. "We heard the road," she said. "So we came." Draper's head snapped back, annoyance scarring his charm. "This is between men," he snapped. "Then you'll have to pretend not to see us," Ruth said, and folded her hands like a prayer that didn't ask anything. Ellie stepped onto the porch into the light. No braid today, just hair pulling free, a thin ribbon of red, catching the morning low like blood refusing to fade. She spoke to the riders, but she looked at the women. "If I go, this door goes with me," she said. This table, these jars, the steam that holds a fever so a child can catch her breath. I won't run for your quiet. Kerrigan huffed. You think you're the first to say no? The world doesn't bend because your mouth made a sound. Maggie Pearson slipped from her mother's grip and ran 3 steps closer. Her name is Ellie, she announced with the confidence of a 10-year-old presenting evidence. She made my chest stop hurting. Maggie, her mother hissed, pulling her back. The boy from the far section raised a tentative hand as if school rules applied. She fixed my ma's hand, he said, voice thin as twine. She sews straight. A laugh scraped out of Jasper Oates without humor. This is a circus. No, Robert said. This is a town. Cal Turner's reins creaked in his hands. He looked at Draper, at Hale, at Ellie, at the girl who'd said a name like it was a saving. Hale buried his shovel. Cal muttered almost to himself. I saw the mound. He lifted his chin. And he buried his rifle, too. Draper turned on him, eyes narrowing. You've been counting dirt. I've been counting what kind of men we are, Cal shot back, surprising himself with the shape of backbone in his own voice. A low murmur slid through the riders like wind through dry grass. Not agreement, not yet, but not certainty either. The sheriff came last. You could hear him before you saw him, not because of noise, because the others made room in the air. A badge dull with dust. A horse that knew when to stop without being told. He drew up beside Draper and took in the fence, the porch, the woman, the wagon, the stone that said stay. His jaw moved as if chewing something tough he intended to swallow anyway. Hail, he said, tipping the brim a fraction. Draper filed complaint in town. Claims you're harboring property and obstructing recovery. Also claims someone lit your place months back and now there's mutterings you're stirring unrest. Robert's mouth dried. Ellie's fingers curled against her thigh until the nails left crescents. Ruth Garner sat straighter on the wagon seat like a church pew, suddenly remembered it could be a witness stand. The sheriff looked at the gathered faces, at the children, at the old women who had seen more burials than weddings, at the men on horses pretending their saddles didn't rock with nerves. He sighed through his nose. What I see, he said, is a rebuilt house, and a woman folks are willing to stand behind without being told. What I don't see is a chain, or a mark on her that says she belongs to anyone but herself. Draper's laugh came sharp. Laws on paper, Sheriff. Not in your feelings. True, the sheriff said, eyes on Draper now, but the paper you're waving tells me a man with a desk sold a person he never met to a man who likes to collect. I can read Silas. I can also smell when smoke didn't come from a kitchen. He tipped his chin toward the black scars in the yard. You set that fire. Silas's smile thinned. You got witnesses. Not yet, the sheriff said. But I got eyes. Silas shifted in the saddle anger, twitching through his fingers toward the holster. Are you taking her side? I'm taking the side of not making a new grave before breakfast, the sheriff said. Make that easier on me and turn your horse. A strand of silence snapped. Draper's hand moved. The world narrowed to that single motion. Leather. Metal. Intent. Robert took one step down off the porch, not toward Draper, toward Ellie. He reached without looking and found her hand. Her grasp met his strong, steady. No, she said, too soft to carry loud enough to hold him. Draper drew. The horse under him spooked, why no one would be able to agree later. Wind. A hawk's shadow, the way 11 hearts all clenched at once. The muzzle jerked as the horse danced. The shot slapped the morning. Stone coughed dust off the threshold. A white chip leapt and spun. When it fell, a hairline crack ran through the carved word. Stay. It held. Robert did not flinch. He stepped forward, not fast, not foolish, and put his body between the porch and Draper's second intent. He kept his hands open, palms out. Hale, the sheriff, barked, stand down. I am Robert said, still moving. His voice had the calm of a man who had already once decided what kind of man he would be today. Silas, he said, eyes on the rider. If you pull that trigger again, you don't get to say you were taking back property. You'll have to say you shot a woman in front of a town that came to remember itself. Draper's face changed, not softened, shifted. He saw it then, the wagon, the women, the boys with fists so tight, their fingernails dug crescent moons, the sheriff's jaw set like a hinge. refusing to break the crack across the word on the stone that somehow made it look stronger. Kerrigan swore under his breath. Oates stared at the ruined chip as if it held a map out of a life he'd never imagined leaving. Cal Turner's gun hand lowered. He didn't remember telling it to. Draper's pistol hovered. A choice. An old habit muttering in the bones. A new fact insisting on being counted. He spat over his boot. Not worth the powder, he growled, lying to himself loud enough for others to hear it and pretend to believe. He holstered, yanked the reins, turned. No cheer rose. This wasn't that kind of victory. It was lighter than that. Heavier. One by one, the riders followed. Kerrigan last, his mustache bristling with wounded pride. He glanced once at Ellie and found a gaze that didn't flinch and didn't hate him either. It undid him more than hate would have. He looked away and rode. The sheriff stayed a beat longer. He looked at the porch, at the stone, at the woman and man whose hands were still linked as if one heartbeat had learned how to cross skin. He cleared his throat. "I'll be by end of week," he said. "Ask some questions I should have asked months ago. Bring some extra nails for your fence. If men come on this road again looking to collect people, they'll meet a badge before they meet your gate." Robert nodded. "Appreciate it." The sheriff tipped the brim and turned his horse. The wagon creaked closer. Ruth Garner slid down bones, remembering how to be young for 1 minute. She took Ellie's face in both hands the way a mother checks fever, then kissed her forehead like a seal. "We heard the road," she said again. "And we came." Ellie's mouth trembled. She swallowed the shake and let the breath out through her nose. "Thank you." Maggie wriggled free and ran straight to the threshold. She knelt, touched the chip, traced the crack with a careful finger. "Did it break?" she asked, panicked. Ellie knelt beside her. "No," she said. "It learned a new way to be strong." Maggie nodded as if that made more sense than anything she'd ever been told in school. She opened her palm. A small thing lay there, flat warm from her hand. The chipped piece of stone. "Keep it," she said, "in case you need a little stay to carry." Ellie closed the child's fingers back around the chip. "You keep it," she whispered, "and when the wind tries to scare you, you put it in your pocket and remember today." Maggie nodded fiercely and gripped it like a talisman. The wagon rolled away first. Neighbors peeled off. The yard filled back up with wind and bird noise and the brittle laughter of men far down the road trying to turn the day into a story they could live with. Robert looked at Ellie. Ellie looked at Robert. Their fingers were still laced. They became aware of it at the same time and didn't let go. "You didn't lift steel," she said. "I didn't run," he answered. They both looked down at the cracked word. "Stay." Robert knelt and brushed the dust from the groove with the side of his hand. He pressed his palm flat and closed his eyes. "Still here," he said to the stone, to the door, to the sky. Ellie crouched beside him and added her palm to his. Her hand was smaller. It covered part of the crack and some of the word. "We keep building," she said. "Not because they left. Because we didn't." He nodded. The breath he drew next felt like the first one after drowning. When they stood, the house looked different, not safer, truer. The beam inside still held her name. The bowl on the table still held a painted sun. The woven ring in the window moved in a breeze that finally felt like wind again, and not warning. "Coffee?" he asked, "because sometimes you have to invite ordinary back in and make it sit." She smiled at that, the small, private kind. "Yes," she said, "and then we fix the hinge that squeaks, and then we pull the weeds that think they can grow where the corn goes." And then he said, glancing at the garden, the fence, the place where a rifle slept under dirt, like a bad idea, finally given a grave, "We plant winter wheat. It's late, but not too late." "Not too late," she repeated as if the words were a blessing. The sun cleared the ridge with a steady climb. In its light, the crack in the stone didn't look like a wound. It looked like a line drawn through a word to underline it. Stay. They stepped over it together and went inside to put on coffee and boil water and begin again. The road behind them did what roads do. It stretched. It forgot. It waited. The road ahead did something better. It held. Winter settled in slow with frost that rimmed the fence rails silver before dawn and smoke that curled from the chimney long after dusk. The rebuilt cabin creaked in the wind but held firm, its walls stitched from both old scars and new boards. Inside, warmth pulsed fire in the hearth, bread on the table, voices that no longer trembled when silence fell. Robert mended tools in the evenings, his broad hands steady the weight of his buried rifle fading from his shoulders more each day. Ellie stirred herbs into teas, laughter of children, sometimes trailing from the doorway after lessons at her table. The bowl with the painted sun glowed faint in lamplight. The beam above still bore her carved name. The stone at the threshold bore its crack like a badge of survival. On the first heavy snow, they woke to muffled stillness. Robert pulled on boots and opened the door to a white world flake still tumbling thick. Ellie stood beside him, shawl pulled tight, her breath misting. "Looks like the land's been remade again," he said softly. She smiled faint. "Not remade, covered. Underneath it's still ours." He looked down at her, the firelight behind her, the cold light before her. For a moment he saw her as she had been in the well eyes, wild voice, raw. And then he saw her as she was now, upright, steady, no longer asking to belong but declaring it with every breath. He reached for her hand, laced his fingers through hers, and together they stepped into the snow. By spring the wheat had risen pale blades, shivering in rows. Children helped plant women, helped bake. Men came quietly with broken wagon wheels and stiff joints, leaving with more than they had brought. The name Sundaughter no longer carried suspicion. It carried gratitude. Ellie wore it without pride, without fear. She wore it as a reminder, light grows where darkness once claimed root. Robert's name too had shifted, no longer whispered in fear as the bounty man who once collected scalps. Now he was the builder, the one who mended, the one who stayed. Together they had become the story the town told itself when it needed to believe survival could be gentler than vengeance. On a summer evening, the field gold with grain. Maggie Pearson ran to the porch with a stone clutched in her small fist. The chipped piece from the threshold. She held it up proudly. "Still got it," she said. "It helped when I got scared at night." Ellie knelt, brushed a braid from the girl's face, and kissed her forehead. "Keep it, Maggie. That piece belongs to you now." Robert ruffled the girl's hair and sent her running back to her mother. He turned to Ellie, eyes softer than the fading sun. "She carries our crack like a charm." Ellie smiled. "It means she knows how to stay." The years ahead were not promised peace. Draper's kind still rode the roads, law still bent toward paper, when it should have bent toward truth. But the land had learned something. The cabin had learned something. They had learned something. When strangers passed sharp-coated men from the east, asking questions with suspicion, hidden under politeness, Ellie would simply rest her hand on the beam where her name was carved. Robert would press his palm to the threshold stone when he crossed it each morning, the crack cool and steady beneath his skin. They had buried fire. They had buried steel. They had planted seeds instead. And when their child was born a girl with lungs strong enough to rattle windows, they named her Hope. Not for poetry, for truth. Hope grew barefoot in the fields, laughter ringing where gunfire once had. She learned to stitch herbs into bundles, to sand wood smooth, to read the sky for rain. When she was old enough to ask what the crack in the threshold meant, Ellie knelt and told her, "It means even when the world tries to break you, you don't fall apart. You hold. You stay." Robert, listening from the porch, swallowed hard and nodded. The house became more than a house. It became proof that people could change, that wounds could bloom, that love could rise not out of possession but out of choice. Ellie no longer whispered to be allowed to belong. Robert no longer carried a rifle to prove he did. Together, they chose to stay. And the town watching learned something too. If this story stirred something in you, if you believe like we do, that love can rise even from ash and shadow, then don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss another story drawn from the wild frontier of the heart. And most importantly, share this story with someone who needs a little hope today. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.